Hello, everybody. It's lovely to see you all. So I'm going to, first of all, introduce myself and the Transparency Task Force. I'm going to say a few words about Lloyds Banking Group. I'm then going to confirm the order of the speakers, and then we'll get stuck into our first presenter, Kevin Hollinrake MP, who's with us again, and we're very pleased to have Kevin with us once more. So there are some people who are brand new to the Transparency Task Force, so let me briefly explain that the Transparency Task Force is a UK-based but increasingly international organisation. We are a certified social enterprise, which means that we are formally constituted not to make a profit. We don't operate as a profit-making machine. We operate with a view to making impact, not money. And the impact that we want to make is about changing the way the financial system works. We want the financial system to be fair, to be transparent, to be truthful, to be trustworthy. And frankly, we see that it's a long way from that at the moment. We believe that all needs to change. We work by engaging with parliamentarians, with the media, with academics, with policymakers, all kinds of people. And we do a range of pretty creative things to get attention to the issues that we want to draw attention to. And we've got some success. We've been able to get a couple of government inquiries opened. We've been very busy involved with regulatory consultations, and we see part of our remit as drawing attention to when the financial system doesn't behave the way that it should. And frankly, that sometimes includes drawing attention to regulatory failure that we believe does happen from time to time. That is what is, in very broad terms, what the Transparency Task Force is all about. What I'm going to do now is spend a few moments talking about Violation Tracker for reasons that will become quite clear. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So this is Violation Tracker. Violation Tracker is a US-based database. However, I'm very pleased to say that it's coming to the UK. So by probably about November this year, Violation Tracker will be up and running with the UK data. At the moment, it's only got data in it relating to offences against US authorities. Now, despite that, it has a lot of information about British companies, because British companies are being caught doing the wrong things by the regulators and the enforcement agencies in the USA. So for those of you that haven't seen it at all, I think you'll like it. I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour through it. Here we go. So the first thing you can do with Violation Tracker is you can click on industry totals, this bit here. And we'll circulate a link to this so you can do it in your own time. But in the meantime, just have a look at my screen. You'll see that financial services is the worst offending industry. Not only is it the worst offending industry, it's the worst offending industry by so far that it accounts for approximately half of all the financial infringements that have been recorded against the many, many US authorities. The figure I've just kind of highlighted there is 331 billion, not million, 331 billion, 558 million, 339,161 dollars. That's a huge number. But if you also take into account that that is roughly half of the absolute total, so roughly $1 in two, that is a fine against a company by the US authorities, relates directly to the financial services sector. In other words, if you add up all the companies in positions 2 and onwards, pharmaceuticals, oil and gas, motor vehicles, utilities, healthcare, telecoms, IT, etc., they all, when added up together, equate to roughly the equivalent of financial services. And when you click on the financial services tab, it'll give you the breakdown of the individual worst offenders: Bank of America, JP Morgan, Citigroup, as you can see. And then if you scroll down the page, it will give you details about the individual offences by various companies. So here we are talking about Lloyds Banking Group. And the interesting question is, what, if anything, has Lloyds Banking Group done that's been prosecuted by the US authorities? And I can give you the answer to that, because you can click on parent companies at the top, and you can put in Lloyds Banking Group. And then within a few seconds, you have this information. Lloyds Banking Group, based in the UK, total of $545,725,000 worth of fines against it for financial offences, competition-related offences, employment-related offences, and environment-related offences. Quite a nice broad spread there of infringements against Lloyds Banking Group. And if you then click on the individual cases, for example, I'm going to click on this one here, interest rate benchmark manipulation, which some of our speakers and guests today know a lot about because they were blowing the whistle on this kind of thing. Lloyds Banking Group in 2014, a fine of $105 million for interest rate benchmark manipulation. And in relation to LIBOR, and if you then click on this bit here where it says source of data, it will take you to the actual originating data about the particular case. And it's a very, very powerful database. That's why we've been working quite hard over the last year and a bit to encourage people to back and support the idea of violation tracker coming to the UK, which is exactly what it's doing. As you all know, the theme for this evening is Lloyds Bank scandal and why it really matters. Now, we're obviously going to be spending quite a bit of time talking about the individual cases and experiences, frankly, the very sad and worrying and shocking individual cases and experiences of some of the people on tonight's call. But we're also going to be very, very mindful of the fact that the data suggests that these are not, if you like, accidental one-off infringements. There's a bit of a pattern here. And towards the end of the session, Paul Carlier in particular is going to be speaking about the idea that the problems and issues we'll be discussing this evening are not some kind of accident. They're actually a part of the, if you like, the cultural dimension to the organization itself. We're going to be having the following speakers, all of whom are eminently qualified to be sharing their thoughts with us this evening. In a moment, we're going to go to Kevin Hollinrake, then Anthony Stansfeld, I should say Kevin Hollinrake MP, then Anthony Stansfeld, then Mike McGarth, then Professor David Llewellyn. Professor Llewellyn is quite new to the Transparency Task Force, but the work that he does is supremely aligned with our efforts to fix the financial system. Very pleased that he's with us tonight. We then go to William May, Keith Elliott, Francis May, Chandila Fernando, forgive me if I've not pronounced your surname that well, Chandila, then Paul Carlier, then Robert Kibbler. And hopefully we'll have some time after all of that for a bit of Q&A and discussion. We are scheduled to finish at 8 o'clock. I'm not doing anything immediately afterwards, so if it suits and we want to carry on chatting, we can. We'll keep the channel open, but let's try to stick to time. So all the speakers are aware that I'm asking them to all be as time efficient as possible. And please definitely do not go over your allocated time, just so we can run to good order. I'm now going to invite my colleague Alexandra, who's our head of events, to deal with a couple of housekeeping points, and then we'll go over to a very popular speaker within our community, Mr. Kevin Hollinrake, and then we'll go from there. Alexandra, over to you. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks for being here. Just to let you know, we are recording this session. We will be editing it and uploading it to our YouTube channel. We'll do it as quick as possible, and I'll let you know by email once it's available to watch. Also, just to let you know that you're welcome to use the chat as much as you want to introduce yourself, make any comments, put your social media and contact details in there. I'll circulate all the notes from the chat in a follow-up email tomorrow. And also, if you use Twitter, please do tweet during the event. I'll put our Twitter handle and some hashtags that you can use. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. That's perfect, super duper. So we're going to be going to Kevin Hollinrake in just a moment. Kevin's spoken at several Transparency Task Force events over the last couple of years. There's a small but growing number of parliamentarians, in my view, who really do get the issues that we talk about within the TTF, and Kevin, is very much at the top of that tree in terms of understanding and engagement, and we're always very grateful to him for giving up his time to share his thoughts. So Kevin, over to you, sir. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Andy, and thanks for your introduction and for putting on this event. In fact, these series of events, because we talk about this stuff a lot, as you know. So I suppose the exam question is Lloyds banking scandal and why it matters. And the simple answer to that, in my view, is that it creates the burning platform which will ultimately end the state of financial feudalism we have in this country. And I can put it no stronger than that, or no weaker than that, certainly. Because I think in the past, so many people in the financial services community within the UK have been untouchable. In fact, we wrote a piece calling RBS the Untouchables in terms of their disgraceful behaviour through the GRG scandal. But so it fatally undermines much of the trust we had in corporations, much of the trust we have in senior people within the banking sector and in societal figures generally, and the trust we had in regulators. And that might sound bad, that we're losing all this trust, but I think there should be a recognition. There is finally a recognition, I think, that this stuff is actually going to have to be dealt with, and is being dealt with. And many on this call will think it's not being dealt with quickly enough, and I would agree with that. But this stuff takes some time to change. But I mean, the scandal itself wasn't really a Lloyds Bank scandal solely. It was a HBOS scandal, of course. And HBOS was an organisation that had just an unsustainable business model in the fact it was borrowing short and lending long. My constituent, actually, Paul Moore, was a whistleblower back he got sacked in 2004 for, he was one of the senior financial people in HBOS, and he drew attention to the flaws in how the business was being run, which ultimately led to the James Crosby having to step down from various roles and lose his knighthood, I think, and part of his pension, who was then chief executive, I think, of HBOS. But of course, HBOS had its account signed off by KPMG in February of 2008, just before it was taken over by Lloyds, and it was signed off as a going concern. KPMG were never properly investigated in terms of their role in that, how they signed off their accounts, despite the fact it failed only a few months later. KPMG, who have just been fined, of course, £15 million for it's a recommended fine, £50 million for their role in the Silent Night scandal. So all these kind of issues were never highlighted. I think the key thing in this whole story is none of these issues were ever highlighted by the regulator. In fact, people on this call have taken issues to the regulator in the past, the FCA, and very little has been done about it. This stuff is brought to light by people like Paul Moore, who sadly passed away now, but like Nicky and Paul Turner at HBOS, when their business had been ripped apart by the later proven scandal there. Sally Masterton in 2013, of course, similarly drew attention to what was happening at HBOS, or what had been happening. And all these people were simply pushed to one side, discredited, and it took until 2017 for this to be proven in court, for this to be taken seriously. And thankfully, your next speaker, Anthony Stansfeld, at Thames Valley Police did a tremendous job. The Thames Valley Police did a tremendous job in actually prosecuting this crime at HBOS when nobody else wanted to. But the thing that is most striking about all this stuff is, people will do bad stuff. We're human beings. People do bad stuff. There are always going to be some bad apples in the barrel. What you need to happen, of course, is when this stuff does come to light or is drawn to the attention of regulators, the regulators should act. And that's what we don't see time and time again with the FCA. They don't act. When Sally Masterton drafted her report, Project Lord Turnbull report, all about HBOS and the Lloyds Bank, basically Lloyds just wrote to the FCA and said she's not a cogent witness, and the FCA left it at that, rather than going in there and understanding what was going on and discovering this stuff and dealing with it early. Instead, we let Lloyds cover this up for 10 years. And so in 10 years later, 2017, in February of that year, the convictions of 2 bank managers and a number of people at QCS. And then, of course, we had Lloyds looking very repentant and promising to do the right thing, of course, at that point in time, as if they'd just discovered this had happened. And actually, it was a series of cover-ups over that 10-year period. It's currently still being investigated, which you remember, by Dame Linda Dobbs. And again, the vindications of the people like the Turners and many other people, some people on this call, no doubt, that this fraud had taken place, and a much bigger fraud than has been proven, of course, which we'll talk about in a second. Then a vindication of Sally Master in 2018, when she was apologised to by Lloyds and compensated for the fact they discredited her for 5 years. And despite the fact that Lloyds were banked to rights in all these areas, of course, then we let them run their own compensation scheme for the victims, incredibly. And it took another probably 2 years of people like the APPG on Fair Business Banking and the SME Alliance and others saying, and many of the victims saying, this process of compensation is completely flawed. And finally, Ross Cranston was commissioned to do a report by the Treasury, which absolutely said it was completely flawed. It's having all to be done again, which again, it should be another lesson learned in terms of how we structure our regulation in this country. So the remedies for all that, now they established the Foskett panel, of course, which is without the influence, outside the influence of Lloyds. And that, I think that, well, it's been reported as such, will provide compensation, proper compensation for the victims for the first time, probably to the tune of about £500 million. So it shows how important that is. But more importantly, I think, it shows that you should never let somebody who's been guilty of this kind of scandal, of distressing people financially, ripping their businesses apart, their lives apart, and then let that organisation run their own compensation scheme. It does sound pretty obvious, but that's what happened. We shouldn't let that happen again. The Foskett panel is doing that now, which I think is a much more fit for purpose approach. But things like the post office, I think, is another accident waiting to happen, because the post office scandal, again, that compensation has been run within the post office, not without it. And the influences of people, the incentives of people within those organisations minimise the level of compensation. So some of the other remedies that are coming through, not everybody is totally agrees with these are good solutions, but they're better than nothing. We now have independent alternative dispute resolution for business complaints between banks and businesses of turnover up to £10 million. The FOS doing up to £6.5 million. Previously, that was £1.8 million, of course. FOS up to £6.5 million turnover. BBRS doing up to £10 million turnover. So there's more redress, free redress, because we all know you can't take a bank to court unless you are very, very wealthy, which most people aren't after they've been ripped apart by their bank. So there are some things that have changed already. That's not our preferred solution. We'd like to see a financial services tribunal, which is a no adverse costs regime, a proper court-based process to resolve these disputes in future. But the other reason this matters is it will bring about other legislative changes. So I said before about Dame Linda Dobbs. I think that will result in some findings which will lead to other sanctions against some of the people involved. I'm very hopeful they will. It'll lead, I think, to something called an Office for the Whistleblower, which should provide proper protections for whistleblowers when they do come forward, because we don't see that in the UK at the moment. And that leads to effectively to much more prosecutions, to greater number of fines. Andy, you were talking about the violation tracker. Just as a rule of thumb, the US fines corporations in the UK about 35 times as much as we do in the UK. About 35 times as much, despite the fact their economy is probably about 6 times bigger. But it's a 6-fold increase effectively. And part of that is because they have a fit for purpose whistleblower regime, where whistleblowers do get protection and do get properly compensated. We'll get a new offence of a failure to prevent economic crime, which will make it much easier to sanction people at, for example, Lloyds and HBOS, who should have spotted this earlier and didn't act on the clear evidence that was brought to them. So in the future, those people will be guilty of a criminal offence, which will have a big deterrent effect, I think, on executives within these organisations. ultimately, the fines that emanate from that and from the Office of the Whistleblower should do something that Anthony, I'm sure, will talk about, is properly resource the crime enforcement agencies in these areas. So the Serious Fraud Office, National Crime Agency, regional fraud organisations that we probably need within our relevant forces, but I'll leave that to more to the experts. But also, it will clean up the whole act. It'll clean up UK PLC, which will be good for UK PLC. It'll mean the economy grows. It'll mean people are more willing to start in business and grow a business and be less afraid of being torn apart by their bank, because there'll be more checks and balances. So a terrible litany, a disgraceful saga, the most disgraceful period in British banking history, which will lead to some good, which will mean the implications effectively for the system overall will be positive, but nevertheless, terrible, terrible consequences for many people involved here, which some of who can't be compensated because they will have passed away.
Kevin, thank you very much indeed. We're going to go straight to our next speaker, but can we first of all put our hands together to thank Kevin for his contribution to today's session. Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. Great input. You've got us off to a great start as always. Thank you very much. And by the way, I watched the adjournment debate last night, and Bim Alofi is talking about there being more regulatory scrutiny. A new committee set up on both parliamentary and House of Lords members seemed like a pretty good idea to me. Let's hope that develops nicely. Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. Let's go straight on to Anthony Stansfeld. So if you can take yourself off mute, Anthony, and spend the 5, 6, 7 or so minutes you've got with us to the best effect you can. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you.
Great. Andy, thanks very much indeed. A very quick observation right at the very start is not only do we not hold senior bankers to account, but we're still putting them in the House of Lords and giving them knighthoods. And you only have to look at our last honours that's just come out. We're absolutely staggered by this. So whether the message is getting over to the establishment, I rather doubt. I think the underlying problem we all face at a national level is that nobody actually investigates fraud, whether it's high-level fraud or the scams at a low level. Probably less than 1% of frauds is actually ever even investigated, let alone actually brought to justice. And as Kevin has mentioned, the last major fraud to be investigated and only partially brought to justice was the HBOS Reading fraud. 2 police forces had turned it down and hadn't investigated it, and the SFO had turned it down. They all found it too difficult and they hadn't got the resources to bother. And certainly if TVP had not taken it on, it would not have been investigated. And the criminals involved would have got off scot-free, nobody would have been compensated, and Lloyds Bank would have continued to conceal it, which they did. And it cost Thames Valley Police £7 million. Lloyds were eventually, I think they were fined 60 million, reduced by the FCA to 45 million for their cooperation. Well, it's a great pity they didn't cooperate a great deal more in the investigation to start with. And that's 45 million went straight back to the Treasury. Not a penny came back to Thames Valley Police. And the one lesson is it's too expensive to take on a fraud for a police force. And that lesson has gone right out, I think, to all police forces. And today, I rather doubt if Thames Valley Police would have been able to take that case on. But the HBOS Reading fraud was only one of several other banking frauds going on at the same time. And some of them, in my view, were probably very much larger. And what is quite clear is that some of the same individuals that were implicated in the HBOS case were also implicated in what was going on in Lloyds in Bristol. We have far too many regulatory authorities that fail to regulate. They just don't regulate. And the FCA and the FRC, the Financial Conduct Authority and Financial Reporting Council, are very prominent in this. Many have overlapping responsibilities and they simply look the other way. They slope their shoulders. When did the FCA actually last take on a major fraud? And as Kevin has mentioned, the failure of the FCA to follow up the Sally Marston Turnbull report is an out-and-out scandal. They sat on it for several years, and they then failed totally to protect her as a whistleblower. The CEO of the FCA has gone on to be governor of the Bank of England, and the chairman of the FCA at the time was previously senior partner of KPMG, who audited Carlier, the Co-op and HBOS, and in HBOS overlooked the massive £1 billion hole in the accounts and the £1 billion fraud. And it is difficult actually to comprehend this sometimes. How can it be sorted out? Well, there are a number of measures that need to be done, but I think the first one is we've got to start actually investigating and prosecuting major frauds. And I think the best way to do this is that individual police forces are too small and don't have the capacity or capability to take on major fraud. It has to be done really at a regional basis, like we do counter-terrorism and serious organized crime. Each region should have a proper fraud, anti-fraud, fraud investigatory capability. And it shouldn't be funded by the police. It should be funded directly through the Treasury. And that could be done quite easily, and it would pay for itself, I think, time and time over within a very short period of time. It would make bankers and accountants and some of the lawyers behave themselves, which they certainly are not doing at the moment. And those that don't behave themselves should be prosecuted and jailed, because the scale of the offences are very large indeed. When was a senior banker last properly investigated and prosecuted for fraud? The answer is they weren't, and they probably got knighthoods or are sitting in the House of Lords today, which I find absolutely extraordinary. We should also ensure that the executive boards of banks have the odd qualified banker on them. At the moment, few, if any, of the banks employ a qualified banker on their executive board. They're mainly composed of accountants and some very dodgy businessmen at the moment. And I mean that quite seriously. So there are a number of things we could do, I think. Firstly, give police the finance and capability to take on fraud. And they would have to employ quite a lot of very good accountants and lawyers to do this. Sort out the composition of the bank's executive boards. Set up a proper system, and we're moving that way, as Kevin has mentioned, to compensate the victims of banking fraud. And one of the things which I haven't gone into, I think others might, is we've got to sort out the insolvency service, which at the moment seems to be quite extraordinary in the way it behaves. And its close links with the accountants that are actually bankrupting companies is far too close, and that really needs a proper investigation. So I think I've had my short period of time, Andy. I will leave it at that, but I can answer any questions at a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Anthony. A great message delivered within time frame. That was superb. We are going to move swiftly ahead because we have such a tight agenda tonight that there will be time for Q&A and discussion a little bit later. I'm keen to move straight on to our next speaker, but of course, before we do that, let's all show our appreciation to Anthony, not just for what he just said, but for what he's been doing for years and years and years to stand up against the injustices and the unfairnesses in the system for all kinds of ordinary folk, and frankly having the courage to drive forward the prosecutions that he so successfully did. Wonderful stuff, sir. Absolutely wonderful stuff. Well, we're now going to go to Mike McGarth. Mike, over to you. We all owe a debt, so to speak, to Mike, because Mike's inspiration was what led to this event happening. So Mike, thank you for your persistence and patience and working with us. And please do make the most of the few minutes that you have ahead of you. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, Alexander, and the staff of the TTF for helping us to bring and present the Lloyds Bank Symposium. It is much appreciated, and we acknowledge the good work you do. As you see from the first slide, how did Lloyds default their customers? And this is the playbook. Could I go to the next slide, please, Alex? Contents are self-explanatory and will be explained as we go through. Next slide. There are 4 examples how a customer got defaulted. A bank customer that had 3 months rental income stolen, a customer involved in an accident, outcome a broken neck, a family member depends on a Lloyds customer through illness, and lastly, a customer has existing conditions. These examples that will affect anyone's ability to deal with the day-to-day banking. Put yourself in any of these positions that cause an extra cost, default, asset loss, instigated a relationship breakup, or left you homeless. It is irrelevant of creed or race, assets were priority. Next slide. Lloyds HBOS Reading, where there was fraud proved in court with the assistance of the Thames Valley Police, as already stated, the cost was £7 million. Mr. Stansfeld has stated there was over £1 billion worth of fraud at Reading alone. And in his opinion, it was greater at Lloyds Bank Bristol Recovery's Business Support Unit, BSU. This slide gives you everyone an idea of the size, scope, complexity and procedures of the sheer number of Lloyds Bank Recovery's business support units around the UK. An estimated 60,000 customers and approximately 5 billion of non-core assets were processed and at these profit centres. This was indeed a military executed operation. Next slide. Reality. The majority of customers were never given an option to return to mainstream banking, as profit centre fees and interest charges in certain cases exceeded 35%. Mr. Stansfeld has estimated 2.5 billion non-core assets were taken from just Lloyds HBOS Reading and Lloyds Bristol Recovery's Business Support Unit. Many at Lloyds HBOS Reading are still waiting to be compensated. Next slide. Securitisation. There are banking experts talking later who can explain more about securitisation, but using a special purpose vehicle, SPV, or a collateralized debt obligation, a CDO, to demonstrate asset multiplied 30 equals securitization. Experts believe that the standard for securitization was approximately asset multiplied by 42, but literature confirms Northern Rock used asset multiplied by 50 to securitize their assets. By using 30 times securitization, it is conservative and realistic. So an asset used as security of £200,000 times 30 securitization equals £6 million. Can you imagine the commission on that at 0.05% is £30,000. At 1% is £60,000. A customer has secured a loan of £100,000 as an example at loan to value of 50%. This clearly shows conflicting financial incentives for a relationship manager to sell these types of secure products. The securitization should be disclosed to the customer on signing any agreement. Next slide. The Asset Protection Scheme, the APS 7th of March 2009, I've sent Alexander a copy of this document that can be used on the recorded presentation. In this document, it confirms 250 billion of good quality non-core assets were used by Lloyds Bank as collateral to be bailed out by the Treasury. These assets would surely have been securitized at standard practice. The government charged 15.6 billion to Lloyds Bank to participate in the Asset Protection Scheme. Lloyds Bank classed these assets as toxic and then removed over 200 billion from their balance sheet. Your farm, your business, your premise, or your home was part of that 200 billion. Next slide. On transfer to the recoveries, Lloyds Bank treated the outstanding balance as a bad debt, which they then claimed 40% as loan impairments. So a 100 grand loan against a 200 grand asset and a £6 million securitization, Lloyds Bank have just claimed £40,000 back from the taxman, albeit over the next few years. Maximum loss now to Lloyds Bank is £60,000. Yet from the date of the loan impairment, Lloyds Bank still charged interest on the £400,000 outstanding debt. Next slide. As an individual, the chances of beating Lloyds Bank are a fraction of 1%. Herbert Bundy, 36 years ago, was the last individual to win a court case. Herbert actually had a heart attack in the witness box. Coin Group settled without a non-disclosure agreement, and Nicky, Paul, and Noel, as we know, have all negotiated a settlement outside the court and beat the banker. But at what cost? 10 years, credit history destruction, being classed as a financial leper, stress, suicidal attempts. Let's just pause there for a moment. Noel stated he had thought about suicide. Over 2,200 bank customers committed suicide in the UK and Ireland over banking issues. They must never be forgotten. Next slide. Deterrence in the form of the FSA and the FCA UK fines is clearly not working, as also proved by the US violation tracker fines. Lloyds employees have stated you will not be the first or the last. Solicitors usually require funds up front before any hint of an opinion that you may have a claim. Documentation is often incomplete due to disclosure. We have the best legal system in the world, provided you can afford to lodge the claim correctly. Even then, a 10 million legal insurance was inadequate in a recent Lloyds Bank customer's claim. As an individual, you have a last chip at the chair, a poker term used to state you have one last chance, and Lloyds Bank know this. Another £2 million litigation cost should conclude the claim in favour of the bank, even if they're wrong. Myself and Chandila Fernando have been putting the collated evidence into a single document for over 3 years. Due to the vast number of documents, legislation, legal opinions, and ex-customers' experience, I'm only able to collate excuse me, this documentation due to the help and assistance of many, including the late Mr. Bobby O'Leary, and other friends and family members, who together have provided me with the support to warrant my existence. I've sent a copy to Alexandra of a copy of a letter from Mr. Anthony Stansfeld to myself, and a financial ombudsman final decision reference vulnerable customer, which will be available for everyone to look at their leisure. Thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.
Mike, thank you very much indeed. Another speaker delivering a very firm, clear, thoughtful, considered opinion, all amounting to the same thing. The Lloyds Banking Group has simply not been fair with people, and the financial, emotional and social consequences have been truly tragic. Can we please put our hands together, not just for the talk, but also for inspiring this whole event? Mike McGarth, thank you very, very much indeed. We're going to go straight over now to Professor David Llewellyn. This will be the first time Professor's been with the TTF, so let's make him very welcome. And once Professor Llewellyn has spoken, we'll take a short Q&A break before we then move on to William May, Keith Elliott, Francis May, Chandila, Paul Carlier and Robert Kibbler. So Professor Llewellyn, over to you please to take the floor, so to speak. Thank you very much.
And Andy, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to this very important meeting. It's really a very great pleasure for me to begin an association with your organisation.
Thank you.
Obviously, the focus of this evening's session is on Lloyds Bank. And there are several very distinguished speakers specifically contributing their experience and knowledge of Lloyds Bank. My starting point, however, is that this is only part of a very much bigger fault line in major parts of the financial services industry. Lloyds Bank is not alone, and I think a previous speaker has made the same point. So my role this evening, if I may, with your permission, although come to think about it, as I've got the microphone even without your permission, I'd like to set a broader context of the financial services industry, and in particular, its culture. So we need this broader perspective because, in my view, you cannot understand the individual specific problems related to a specific institution without the context of three key elements. First of all, the underlying culture of the industry and of the firm. I will give a little bit more emphasis to this in a few moments. Secondly, great emphasis has to be given and to understand the incentive structures embodied within the financial firm. And I divide those incentive structures into two. First of all, there are those which are embedded in the firm itself as a result of its underlying culture. And I'm thinking, for instance, if a firm is giving very high value to shareholder value in the short term, or high value remuneration to sales, then that is clearly going to have a major impact on the behavior of individuals. But secondly, not only that, we have to consider the incentive structures associated with particular activities. And here again, we're thinking of selling financial products. And those particular incentives might be related quite explicitly to bonuses determined by the volume of business undertaken in a particular period. The third element, I think, in this broader context is a very difficult one, but a very important one, and one that a couple of other speakers have also mentioned. Should the focus be on individual decision makers within a financial firm, or the financial firm itself? In other words, who is to be made responsible when things go wrong? Who is to be made accountable when things go wrong? And where are the sanctions to be imposed when things go wrong? In my view, too much emphasis has been given to institutions rather than the individual decision makers within the financial firm. Well, I've had a long connection with financial regulation in various ways. And I was a public interest director of the Personal Investment Authority and have recently been chair of the banking stakeholder group of the European Banking Authority. And I wonder, in the context of this evening's session, whether I might just share a few thoughts of what I've learned from that experience, both as an academic scholar of regulation and also as a practitioner. A few bullet points. First of all, many of the problems in banking, if not all of the bad problems in banking and financial services generally, whether we talk about the banking crisis, whether we talk about the LIBOR scandal, the mis-selling of various financial products, and of course, the issue of Lloyds that we're talking about. Many of these problems have their origin basically in the underlying culture of the firm, the incentive structures that are created and embedded within the firm, and the failure to make certain key individuals responsible and accountable for what has gone wrong. My second conclusion is that there are limits to what regulation can do. I think sometimes we expect too much of it. There are limits to what it can do, especially if the underlying culture within the industry, within the financial firm, is hazardous and against the consumer interest. So my conclusion has been that regulation is definitely a necessary part of the process, but it's not a sufficient condition. And in particular, we need to give rather more emphasis to individual responsibility. Indeed, I'd go a little bit further than that and argue that I think there is a danger that excessive regulation can actually detract from the underlying culture of an organization. And for instance, regulatory minimum standards often become the actual standards. It tends to lead to box ticking of regulation and a general feeling that if something is not explicitly disallowed, it's okay to do it. And the danger that regulation can take over from management the responsibility of setting standards. And so my conclusion there is definitely we need regulation, but let's make sure that that does not, in a sense, detract from the importance of the institution developing its own internal culture. My further conclusion, of course, is that incentive structures are absolutely crucial and that we need to give a lot of thought to examining how incentive structures are created, how they are monitored, and what sanctions can be imposed on financial firms if their internal incentive structures are clearly hazardous to consumer interests. I also believe, I think one of the lessons I've come to, again, sorry, forgive me for repeating it, more important emphasis on the role of individuals in terms of accountability and sanctions. I've often wondered when sitting around a regulatory board meeting, where we might decide to impose a £500,000 fine on an institution, I just wonder whether, in fact, a £20,000 fine on the individuals who were actually responsible for the bad decisions, whether that might have a bigger effect on leading to better behaviour in the future. So the importance of culture is obviously very important. I don't want to get into a long discussion because time is limited about what we really mean by culture. We're talking about the values embedded within the organization, the true values, the ethical standards, and of course, again, the incentive structure. Clearly, culture is central to behavior. It creates business standards. The culture of an organization creates employee attitudes, employees' behavior, and also, above all, if the underlying culture and incentive structures are hazardous, then that can have a major negative impact on consumer trust and confidence. If I may just conclude with a little bit more development about the role of individual behavior. I have a lovely word here. It is a true word, and I doubt that anybody taking part in this has ever used this word in the last 10 years. Anthropomorphization. It's a lovely word. It's a true word. What it means is that we assign human characteristics to innate objects or institutions. You see, in many ways, banks as such do not make decisions. My university does not make decisions. It's key individuals within those organizations that make decisions. And so again, I think I'm coming round to emphasizing yet more the role of trying to refocus our approach to this by looking at individual responsibilities. And I've done a little bit of work on this, and if anyone is interested in taking this further, I'd strongly advise you to look at a long neglected area of economics called identity economics. The basic idea here is that all of us have different identities. You are a mother, a father, a friend, you have relations, you work in an organization, you may or not go to church or have religious beliefs. And my point is that the basic idea here is that the culture is different dependent on which of those identities you are thinking of at the time. And ethical and moral standards often vary according to which identity the individual is currently focusing upon. So I would argue, and this may be a little bit contentious, I would argue that the decision makers who've made very bad and hazardous decisions in banks are not necessarily bad people. In other words, I don't believe that those bankers who were criminally responsible for libel scandals would actually steal money from the church collection box on a Sunday morning. I don't believe that the salespeople in banks who were selling very dodgy financial products would in fact believe that they could ever sell those products to their favorite grandmother. So in other words, our behavior, whatever our moral, ethical standards are in general, there's a great deal of evidence that suggests that our behavior is very much determined by the identity that we adopt at the time, and in particular, when in the workplace, that the identity of the workplace itself creates a particular approach to decision making, that we are prepared to do things within the workplace that we would never dream of doing with our friends, relations, or elsewhere. So again, I come back to the idea that we do need to give a lot of emphasis to the incentive structures faced by individuals as well as by the firms. And there is a great deal of evidence that suggests that within financial firms, individuals are subject to a lot of peer pressure. And that peer pressure often induces individuals to behave in a way that they wouldn't behave in different contexts. And so again, the culture of the organization is a very powerful influence on behavior. So I think I would conclude, Andy, and thank you once again for inviting me, just to emphasize again, culture and individual responsibility. I'm not for 1 minute arguing that we should not also give a lot of attention to the financial firm. Of course, that's what we are doing tonight with Lloyds Bank. But let's forget that it's not so much the firm that is making decisions, but individual people within that firm. And therefore, perhaps we should be giving more emphasis, particularly in terms of sanctions. So my final conclusion is that it's both the institutions and the individuals that should be penalized for their irresponsible behavior. Forgive me if I've overstepped my time.
That was pretty much perfect, absolutely perfect in every way imaginable, timing-wise, content delivery. You've given us a kind of broad base of understanding around some of those issues, David. If I may, we'll have a short Q&A session now. I'm going to put a couple of thoughts to you. Could you tell us what your views are on this concept of regulatory capture? That's a topic that comes up quite a bit in our various events, David. And also, could you share your thoughts about how effective the senior managers certification regime has been thus far? If you wouldn't mind speaking to those 2 points, regulatory capture and the senior managers certification regime. David, thank you very much.
Regulatory capture, I think, is a very important issue. And there is no doubt that bankers are paid far, far more than regulators and use a lot of resources putting pressure on regulators in a particular way. And the way I'd like to answer that more specifically is just with a very homely example. When I was on the board of the Personal Investment Authority, our job was to protect the consumer. That was our central role. I was very often invited to lunches and dinners by financial firms. Not once was I invited by a consumer for lunch or dinner. The whole pressure is far more coming from the industry than necessarily from the consumers that we're trying to protect. There are very good reasons, understandable reasons why that should be so. But I just emphasize that regulators are definitely under a lot of pressure, both in the United States and the United Kingdom. And you wouldn't believe some of the arguments that I've heard arguing against why a particular regulation should be abandoned. On the senior management regime, I don't think that has really been very effective at all. I think it's been watered down.
Yeah.
I don't think that, I'm not sure that there's been any sanctions imposed on any individuals as a result of the senior managers regime. So the idea behind it, and I must, if I may, just say that many, many years ago, I was advocating something like this when I was on the board of the PIA. The idea is good, but it's never as good as the way it's going to be implemented in practice.
Absolutely.
And I fear it's rather weak in that respect.
Thank you so much for those responses. We're good for time, so thank you to everybody for helping us keep the time, which is just wonderful. Please raise your hand either digitally or literally if you'd like to make a comment. Could I please invite everybody to be short with your comments or questions, and we'll look for short comments and in reply as well. Mr. Nigel Cairns was the first gentleman that I saw with his hand up. So Nigel, please take yourself off mute and make your point as succinctly as you may. Thank you very much, Nigel. It's the bottom left part of your screen.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to ask Mr. Llewellyn if he'd like to possibly comment about what he thinks about legal privilege of lawyers acting on behalf of banks, and of the predisposition for banks hiding behind them, where obviously no personal accountability is possible or evident.
Lawyers are paid very, very high fees by bankers, and there's a whole sub-industry in the legal profession on regulation, and banking regulation in particular. I know a little bit about that because for my sins, I've been involved with that in a consultancy way in the past. So I'm not quite sure exactly what the focus of your question was, other than to say I know that lawyers are very powerful, and many times bankers will hide behind a legal judgment. That legal judgment says, well, technically what you've done is okay, even though basically we know it is the wrong thing to do.
Yep.
Therefore, in many ways, the law, or the way that law is interpreted by lawyers, is used to justify behavior and decisions that deep down we know are not right.
Thank you, David. Your reply reminds me of the event we ran in Washington, DC, excuse me, a couple of years ago. I was introduced to the word defensible. The lawyers that were present at the meeting basically said, this is not about what's right and wrong. All we care about is what we can and can't get away with in court.
I think absolutely right. Yes, that puts it far better than I did.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but thank you very much. We're going to go to Georgina Halford Hall, who's going to introduce herself, then to Mr. Barry James. Then hopefully we'll squeeze one or two others in. Let's be as succinct as we can. Georgina, please take the opportunity to introduce yourself and make your point. Thank you.
Good evening. While I fiddle with the technology at the same time, I'm getting good at this now after over a year. Good evening, everybody, and my sincere apologies for being late. I was tied up in another call that went over with the whistleblower, but I hear from the short things that I've heard so far that the frustration is ongoing, and I actually agree with everything that's been said, which is probably a get out of jail free card on this. But what I was going to say is we actually all know what's wrong, and more importantly, our politicians. I'm delighted to see Kevin, who's the vice chair of the all-party parliamentary group for whistleblowing on this call as well, and Anthony Stansfeld too, because what we need to do as a collective group, and there are 69 on this call, along with all of the ones at Whistleblowers UK and everywhere else, is set out what we want to replace it. Because my tip is every time I'm interviewed, people say, the chair of the Bank of England, Andrew, why is Andrew Bailey in place? We need to get rid of him, don't you agree? And I say, who do you replace him with? And my very limited experience of politicians as part of the APPG has been that we get much more traction when we put forward what we want to replace it. And for me, the senior managers regime is absolutely ridiculous. It's rather like many aspects of the law. And we're proposing to put forward an independent office of the whistleblower by way of ensuring that those people who speak out, and that would be every citizen, is protected, unlike the current ludicrous situation, would be protected against any form of retaliation for speaking out. That there would be the burden on the organisation to ensure that every allegation, subject to triage, is properly investigated by properly independent investigators who have a methodology by which is set out by the office for which they have to report. And that would include regulators like the FCA, to whom some of these incidents would be referred. So there'd be monitoring, evaluation. In fact, Big Brother is watching them for a change. And then, of course, there is the issue of
Georgina, allow me to interrupt you there, Georgina. We need to be quite tight for time, so thank you very much.
Sorry, I can.
That's right. No, we'll hold it there, Georgina. Thank you very much. We're going to go straight to Barry James. Thank you for your point, Georgina, very much. Barry, please be as succinct as you can for me. Thank you.
Well, other than to thank you, Andy, for putting and the team for putting this on, and for the speakers for their work. Professor Llewellyn in particular, obviously, I agree wholeheartedly with a lot of what you said about regulation and about the lack of mechanisms to bring responsibility to bear on both individuals and organisations, and indeed boards. But clearly culture is, as it were, upstream of management and regulation. And culture in the broader sense, and the economics we have, the economics of greed, the mainstream economics which embody that, encourage, do they not? I sort of form a worldview that fosters this kind of frame and thinking. Would you agree with that? And if so, how can we? Isn't it important that we address that as the root of much of this, the way things are framed, the way people think within organisations, and also with the outside of them in regulators and in the political sphere as well?
It's a very important and interesting question, and it shouldn't take us more than 2.5 hours to address that.
Yes.
I think my studies suggest that things changed in the early 80s. And I think and also in the period running up to the banking crisis. And I think the single most important elements, you would use the word greed, was the increasing emphasis on shareholder value as being the ultimate bottom line of decision-making in financial firms. And actually, in a sense, worse than that, short-term shareholder value was the, if you like, overriding principle. And there's a lot, many crises, in my view, actually do come down to the culture of, if you like, excessive shareholder value emphasis. What can be done? Well, that's an interesting question. Now, I'm going to get on a little bit of a hobby horse, but only for a minute. I think if we had a higher number of mutual financial organizations, financial firms in the industry, that would actually have, in my view, a beneficial impact on the overall culture of the industry as a whole. I'm not saying that building societies and mutual life offices are perfect and never ever do anything wrong. It is a fact that even allowing for scale, the volume of complaints, the volume of sanctions, on mutual organizations has been far less than that of shareholder value institutions, which again, I think might testify to the idea that it's an excessive emphasis on shareholder value, or I think you would use the word greed, is a major part of the problem.
Thank you very much indeed.
Sorry, Barry, probably hasn't answered your question correctly, but anyway.
Yeah, I'm sure
I say you could go on for a very long time, but thank you.
Very good indeed. We're going to go to Anthony Stansfeld, then we're going to draw a close to this particular part of the session. It's been a great exchange of ideas. Very pleased to see that Anthony would like to make a point. Anthony, over to you, sir. Thank you.
The one point I will make about shareholders and the value, of course, the banks have actually destroyed their value. Lloyds shares are lower than they've been for a very long time. And Lloyds is very happy to spend their shareholders' money. I mean, they spend nearly $1 billion a year on lawyers. It's not protecting the bank and it's not protecting the shareholders. It's protecting their senior executive management. And their one aim seems to be to protect their bonuses. And when they leave, to leave with a wad of money. They certainly aren't protecting their shareholders, but you only have to look at the shareholder value of the banks to realize that. So that is one point I would disagree with the professor on, I think. Thank you.
Well, can I just, one final point, Annie, I'm sorry. There's a very good little study to be made on looking at what happened to mutual building societies when they converted. As you know, the largest ones, with notable exceptions, did convert into shareholder value institutions. I was on the board of the Halifax and voted against such a conversion and then left the board when they did decide to convert. And what was very, very interesting in relation to your point, Anthony, the big impact of that was the enormous increase overnight in the remuneration of the top directors and members of management. Within a year, salaries sometimes quadrupled, even 10 times the salaries that these people earned when they were part of the mutual. And it's also interesting to note that not one of those converted building societies, but converted into banks, not one of them now exists.
Thank you very much indeed. What an interesting exchange of ideas and thoughts. We're very grateful to you, Professor Llewellyn, for sharing your time with us and your insights and experience that you've accumulated over several years. Can we please all show our appreciation to Professor Llewellyn? Thank you very much indeed. Excellent stuff. Excellent stuff.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Hopefully we'll have you back again sometime.
Yeah, I'm going to stay for the rest of the meeting.
Thank you. That's good. That's good. I'm aware we have Alison Thulis MP with us. Alison, if at any stage you want to say something, please just let me know. We'll be delighted to feed you into the conversation. But what we're going to do now is we're going to go straight to William May. William's got tremendous insight. Some of what William says is truly, truly shocking. So please pin your ears back, as it were, and pay attention to what we're about to hear. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. May. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. I'm afraid my take on things is far more bearish than any of the speakers so far. Some of you may have followed the broadcast of Nick Wallace about Great Post Office trial. I've been looking at that in some small detail, whereas I've been looking at the Lloyds frauds for about 10 years. You'll see Nick Wallace's take on the post office scandal. If we go quickly to the next slide, you'll see that my take on the Lloyds scandal is very similar. Only the difference is the degree to which the government and every arm of state have helped to cover up the wrongdoing. In the case of the post office, just very quickly, they had a computer system which they brought in 1999. It turned out to be faulty. The post office prosecuted 557 of its sub-postmasters. In 2013, they were told there was a bug in it, but they deliberately concealed the so-called Clark advice. Then they lied to Parliament. They used their heavyweight lawyers who caused their sub-postmasters to incur legal costs of 46 million. At the second trial in December 19, they conceded, but it was a limited apology, no admission of liability. The victims had to bear all their legal costs and were left with minimal compensation. The government last year in September set up a non-statutory inquiry. It was only made statutory after the conviction of 39 sub-postmasters were quashed 2 months ago in April, and the victims are still awaiting proper compensation. In the case of Lloyds, the government, as Mike McGarth has mentioned, launched a modified version of the asset protection scheme in November 2009. It was designed by the Treasury and Andrew Bailey, who was then the head of resolution at the Bank of England. It authorised Lloyds and RBS, the two taxpayer-owned banks which they'd bailed out the previous October, to effectively steal the assets of certain business customers for the benefit of their own balance sheets. RBS stayed in the scheme, Lloyds paid to get out, but Lloyds reverted to its own parallel scheme, and as many of you will know, in January 2007, Lloyds had already turned its business support into a profit centre. Nevertheless, the Chancellor, who was then Alistair Darling, HM Treasury and Bailey ploughed on. They knew that they crossed the major red line, and so Bailey oversaw the cover-up of all wrongdoing, notably when he was at the FCA, and now he's been appointed Governor of the Bank of England. The cover-up of the wrongdoing remains firmly in place today. These are some subjective similarities. The involvement of the Treasury, the licence to mistreat, legal wrongdoing, Parliament being misled and ignored, misuse of mediation and inquiries, corporate governance. Just very swiftly on those. The Post Office is wholly owned by the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. The shareholding comes under UK Government and Investments, and the government's got one representative on the board. The emphasis throughout the Post Office trial was always on saving the Post Office brand and preserving its reputation, regardless of the financial and human cost. Very much that is echoed with Lloyds. Lloyds clearly bailed out, the government clearly bailed out Lloyds and RBS in October 2008. UKFI, UK Finance and Investments, then took a 43% stake in Lloyds. In the period 2013 to 2017, UKFI sold all its shares in Lloyds, while simultaneously other arms of state declined to investigate wrongdoing by Lloyds BSU and RBS GRG. This, in my language, is securities fraud. In March 2018, UKFI was merged with UKGI. Once again, the emphasis has always been on preserving financial stability, regardless of the human cost and with no accountability. On licence to mistreat, well, the terms of business between the Post Office and the sub-postmasters is extremely onerous. It obliged the sub-postmasters to explain any shortfalls, and they simply weren't provided with the information to do so. In terms of Lloyds, as we all know, commercial lending remains unregulated in the UK because the banks have insisted that it should be. Thus, only 3 out of 11 of the FCA's principles of business apply to business lending. Banks have no duty of care. They're not required to conduct their business with due skill, care and diligence, or observe proper standards of market conduct. They do not have to pay due regard to the interest of their customers, treat them fairly, and are not required to manage conflicts of interest. Legal wrongdoing. The Post Office prosecuted 557 sub-postmasters over 14 years. As I mentioned, they were provided with the Clark advice in July 2013, but they ploughed on. From 2013 to 2019, they wrongfully defended their position in court and caused the victims to incur legal costs of 46 million. The main firm who has been defending their legal position has been Herbert Smith Freehills. Lloyds and its lawyers have subverted the integrity of the criminal justice system. They have corrupted, manipulated, and ignored due process and the rule of law. The accusations levelled against Lloyds include the redaction, withholding, falsification, and destruction of evidence, fraudulent misrepresentation and perjury in court, systemic forgeries of signature on legal documents, and the reliance, including in court, on deliberately invalid legal documentation. They have spent, reportedly, they spent 850 million in 1 year defending their wrongful legal position. The legal firm that's been behind all this, Herbert Smith Freehills. Parliament, I'll be swift on the other three rather. Parliament being misled and ignored, numerous debates on the Post Office in Parliament from 2014. A year later, the Post Office told Parliament that it had received no evidence that the conviction of any of the people that they prosecuted was unsafe, and they were then accused of lying to Parliament. Lloyds, ditto. numerous debates in Parliament since 2009. MPs have been treated with contempt by the executive branch of government. Successive economic secretaries to the Treasury have led the government's response with denial and stonewalling, as we know, and the Treasury Select Committee has been packed with MPs who have previously worked at the Treasury to ensure that the Treasury's directions are strictly followed. Misuse of mediation inquiries. As some of you may know, the Post Office set up a mediation scheme which ran from 2013 to 2015. However, the Post Office, that was then scuppered in 2015, and a leading MP accused the Post Office of spending public money on a scheme that they themselves had set out to sabotage. Lloyds, well, as we all know, we've had 4 reviews set up after the HBOS Reading trial ended in 2017, all of them wholly unnecessary and a total affront to justice. Now we're presented with a business banking resolution service which remains deeply unsatisfactory on many counts and has echoes of the Post Office mediation scheme set up between 2013 and abandoned in 2015. Corporate governance. Well, both the Post Office and Lloyds claim to observe proper standards of corporate governance, but their conduct has been anything but. In the case of Lloyds, how can maintaining the cover-up of serious banking fraud be remotely compatible with good corporate governance? The major difference is the extent of the cover-up. I would dwell only briefly on the Post Office. As mentioned, they received the Clark advice in 2013 and hid it. They then lied to Parliament and select committees. The Post Office breached their duties to the court as a prosecutor, which is the technical term for what they did. They then spent 100 million using heavyweight lawyers, including Herbert Smith Freehills, to prevent the truth coming out. Moving swiftly on, this is a list of who the Lloyds frauds are being covered up. As you can see, it's a much more serious list of government bodies. It's been a comprehensive cover-up right across the board. I will only dwell on 3 of those tonight, and my reports, which are available on our website, which I'll mention in a minute, covers all of the rest. These are by no means unsubstantiated allegations. As mentioned, as far as Bailey and the Treasury is concerned, Bailey and the Treasury devised and implemented the asset protection scheme. It crossed a major red line in terms of legality. Lloyds then paid 2.5 billion to opt out and reverted to its own scheme. So that was the beginning of the wrongdoing. The middle, as I see it, is Bailey and the Treasury overseeing the cover-up, notably when Bailey was the chief executive of the Financial Conduct Authority. And finally, the end, well, it's been devised by, yes, Bailey and HM Treasury once again, devising the Business Bank Resolution Service, the BBRS, to seal away all banking misconduct forever, ignore all criminality, which is abundant in many cases, refuse any accountability whatever, and award minimal compensation to victims. Senior ministers, well, I've got a bit of a record with this, because my first report was delivered to Theresa May in May 2014. I received a reply from her 3 months later saying came interestingly from the Treasury, saying that no one had any time to discuss it. In May 2020, Priti Patel, courtesy of Anthony Stansfeld, to which many thanks, she received our Lloyds Asset Theft Frauds report, and he received a reply, yes, 3 months later. Other Lloyds victims have put a tremendous amount of work together, and in May this year, the Home Secretary received a massive document called Operation Meadow, which was all about more than 60 cases of Lloyds victims, and we have yet to receive a reply from her. As far as the FCA is concerned, a lot of time has been expended on the Transparency Task Force previous meetings describing the catalogue of regulatory failure which the FCA has been responsible for. HBOS Reading, RBS GRG, Lloyds BSU, you name it, they've done it. They've also conspired with other government agencies to frustrate due and proper process over the bank's signature forgeries, over LIBOR, and IRHP redress. In August last year, the FCA under Chairman Randall announced moves to limit compensation payable to victims of its own regulatory failure. I would say that the FCA has brought regulatory standards in the UK to a new low. And having covered up banking fraud, Andrew Bailey is now disgracing the governorship of the Bank of England and should resign along with Randall and others. The National Crime Agency, Anthony, together with Julian Watts of the Signature Forgeries campaign, presented evidence to the NCA as early as July 2019. As this slide describes, they've now received 24 files, 639 separate reports of signature forgery, and what have they done? Nothing. For 19 months, they've done nothing, and then they finally investigate what had not been alleged, namely the conspiracy between banks to forge signatures when that was never the allegation. In March, also, the NCA ended its investigation into further aspects of the HBOS Reading fraud, claiming there was no evidence of criminality. That's a straightforward lie. Criminality is everywhere. Lynn Owens and Graham Bigger, the head of the NECC, they should also go. And finally, I'm trying to keep this brief. The real casualties, they've been the victims clearly of the frauds, the rule of law, and our country and its reputation. In terms of the victims, they are being actively denied justice now in 4 separate areas. You'll see a further piece on the denial of justice on our website under the heading of additional releases. The Home Secretary, the National Crime Agency, Avon and Somerset Police, and the Business Banking Resolution Service, and of course by Lloyds Bank as well. As far as the rule of law is concerned, the rule of law is a fundamental principle of our democracy, and at its heart lies the equality of all before the law. But that is not how the law is being treated by government. The government appears to treat law as something which can be overridden and ignored when it suits, or manipulated to its advantage. The law is now being used to control and constrain the mass of the population, but financial elites are more confident than ever that laws and oversight apply to them in name only. As mentioned, heavyweight firms of lawyers have been engaged by the Post Office and by Lloyds, and they've used their clients' seemingly unlimited resources to abuse the law and due process. As mentioned, the main casualty of this is our own country. We've allowed regulatory standards to collapse. The EU is withholding an agreement with the City of London over so-called equivalence because it no longer trusts us. It's absolutely right not to do so. The UK's disregard for international law is continuing to be highlighted with respect to Northern Ireland Protocol, but that's only one aspect of a considerably more serious malaise. Our regulatory and prosecutorial systems are rotten. Their comprehensive failures have also been covered up by the silence of opposition parties in Parliament and by a largely complicit press and media, which depends very heavily on the major banks for advertising. With an 80-seat majority, the government believes that it can maintain the cover-up, that the wider public do not understand, or even if they do, they will not care. Clearly, this attitude is deeply improper. The main casualty in all this is our country and its reputation. And finally, just to mention our website, I've whipped through today's presentation. A longer version of that is available on our website, which is lloydsbankassetfrauds.com. In the middle of that is a more in-depth piece entitled The Lloyds Omnibus. And thirdly, as you can see on that slide, the Lloyds Asset Theft Report. That's the one that went to Priti Patel in June last year, and to which we received a reply 3 months later. Anyway, thank you for, that's the report, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, William, for squeezing so much into the time you had available. Really appreciate you sticking to time, which is great. Overall, we're running a little bit behind schedule, so we need to move straight on to our next speaker. And our next speaker is Mr. Keith Elliott. Before Keith takes the floor, let's put our hands together to show our appreciation to William. And I really do urge you to go to his website and look at the hard evidence that he and his colleagues have gathered over a long period of time. Well done, William. Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Keith Elliott, over to you, sir. You've got, I think it was 10 minutes we agreed. Thank you.
That's right. Yes. Good evening, all. My name is Keith Elliott. I want to explain to you in detail examples of how Lloyds BSU scammed businesses, alongside an actual example supported by evidence. David Llewellyn asserted that individuals be taken to task, and I'm going to give you some names here. Now, in March 2008, Matthew Packham, remember that name, he was at Lloyds Business Support, formerly with Lloyds Development Capital, and is now head of risk, SME and mid-markets at Lloyds. He presents to accountancy professionals, including PwC, a document entitled Business Plan for the Expansion of the BSU Investment Team in support of the unit's 3-year plan. And there were 3 key objectives, 2 of which were doubling of income and moving from defenders to strikers. Moreover, the document stated that BSU would in future nurture an entrepreneurial culture with BSU and establish a mindset more akin to private equity, implement a strategy for driving value from increasing number of investment stakes held in BSU relationships. And at the time this was prepared in March 2008, BSU already had stakes within 23 businesses, and a bonus structure would be ring-fenced for distribution between the investment team and any BSU relationship managers closely involved in generation of associated value. Going forward, there's already a pipeline of deals where equity appears likely, and the BSU investment team now has regular contact with LDC. In June 2008, the BSU was set up, headed by Packham, to facilitate equity solutions in Lloyds TSB distressed customers, and which would have targets for enhanced returns. He gives a presentation to accountancy professionals, including a Mr. Irving Warnett and Ian Green at PwC. Again, remember those names, which includes entry pricing, buying the businesses at low value, and one of Packham's objectives, referred to as his balanced scorecard for the calendar year 2008, was to maximize income and gains to BSU. Packham commented, the portfolio has seen significant growth in 2008, and additionally, the pipeline of potential investments continued to build, with 16 new investments identified, of which 4 are anticipated to be taken before the end of the year. And BSU investment team had targets for enhanced returns, and in 2009, the target for this division alone was 55 extra businesses. In July 2008, an email is sent from Mark Shires of PwC. He's the head of mid-market restructuring, business recovery services at PwC, to a multitude of PwC employees, including a certain Irving Warnett and Ian Green, who was Warnett's boss. And in it, Shires refers to, and I quote, a Lloyds TSB protocol for the future implementation of BSU. He had had a number of meetings with BSU, and that BSU has started to change and differentiate itself to include Equity Investments Initiative. Matt Packham sits in Lloyds BSU. He has taken on the responsibility for management of BSU's equity portfolio, i.e. those equity interests BSU is acquiring via restructurings / new bank deals. And we have been invited to meet Matt Packham to see how the firm, PwC, can assist in maximising value for BSU. It is felt that our being company side and director friendly in certain situations assisted BSU in reaching a mutually acceptable solution more easily. And a number of PwC partners will be dining with senior BSU directors on the 12th of August. I've tried to position us as an advisor to Matt and BSU, since the customers in which stakes are taken are less likely to come to us as insolvencies. And at the same time, the head of BSU, Duncan Parks, confirms, I quote, business support is a profit centre and our shareholders expect us to achieve appropriate reward for supporting our customers through their difficulties. So that is the backdrop with which Lloyds BSU investment team began to operate, and where sadly my experience with Lloyds BSU and PwC starts. My company, Premier Motor Auctions, had a turnover of 160 million, with the sale of cars and also the very valuable and profitable government contract to auction all DVLA registration numbers in the UK, a value of £28 million per annum. And the sale of Premier had been agreed for 36 million just 4 months earlier, and all due diligence had been completed. But in March 2008, the deal fell through, couldn't get the funds. PwC acted for the purchase and confirmed annual profits of 2.7 million. and 2008 went on to be a record year for income. And Lloyds file notes at that time confirmed Premier is a business of significant value. And I was at that time searching for a non-exec director to assist with the future expansion. And here's where we start. Lloyds introduced Irving Warnett for the non-exec role. And I have a 2-hour meeting with Warnett re the non-exec position. He's charming, we get on well, and Warnett confirms to Lloyds the same day that the initial agreement has been reached on the non-exec role. And Warnett in that meeting tells me to treat him as his critical friend. 2 days later, Warnett encourages me to agree to separate the DVLA cash flow by putting it on deposit and increasing the overdraft by the same amount. No difference to the balance sheet, but he asserts it's cleaner and the blank will allow the costs offset. Quite frankly, it's good husbandry. It's not our money, and Warnett confirms that he can arrange that, but needs a quick review for the bank in order to increase the overdraft, primarily due to the 1.5 million of the DVLA funds on that day. 2 days later, Warnett introduces BSU, and the Premier account is transferred to BSU. Stuart Atkinson, the area director, has now taken over the Premier account. 2 days later, an email from Ian Green at PwC to Atkinson prior to an evening out with their wives says, looks like an accelerated sale with a big success fee or warrant for the bank. 2 days later, the BSU director, Atkinson, the BSU director confirms, I've checked with Matt Packham, who has confirmed this would not be a proposal where the requirements of the investor and Elliott could easily be reconciled. So we're already we are already to be on a collision course. 2 days later, a draft bank review arrives, and at a subsequent meeting, the overdraft is increased. And it later transpires that Matt Packham is on the lending committee for the increase in the overdraft, and Ian Green also attends the meeting. 3 days later, Atkinson now sends a letter demanding the sale of the business robustly and vigorously via an accelerated mergers and acquisition, with Warnett and Green being the engagement leaders for the repayment of the bank debt. And the next day, an engagement letter arrives signed by Atkinson, putting that Warnett and Green as the engagement leaders and wanting me to sell the company robustly. I refuse to sign this. 1 week later, Warnett now states and writes to me the group was now effectively into the control following the bank the extension of the overdraft. But it later transpires that Lloyds Development Capital and Packham are working closely to take over the company. And so advanced was this that the project was given a name, Project Tick. So they're working to take ownership of my company under Project Tick. And internal documents confirm the numbers coming out of the company appear to be better than those we were initially working with. 3-year forecasts have been prepared. And John Swarbrick, the LDC director and Leeds, is supportive of the proposal. Lloyds then create a buy team and a sell team within the bank, with Atkinson, the BSU director, the head of the sell team, leading another six staff members, and Packham, the head of the buy team, leading another staff members within the bank. So Atkinson is therefore selling the business to Packham, and this is all going on behind my back. I then introduce Endless LLP, an equity partnership to invest and take the borrowings back to as was before PwC arrived. They write to me saying, we believe Premier is an excellent business, but Lloyds reject their proposals and want 50% ownership. And the deal now becomes Project TOC, as Lloyds changed the deal to include Endless. And Lloyds' internal notes at that time, a business that is robust even in a difficult trading environment. Then just 3 months after Warnett arrived, a formal offer is sent by Lloyds to buy the Premier out of pre-pack administration with a newco formed and owned by Lloyds and Endless. And Warnett, in his review of the 21st of August, suggests a business enterprise of 14 million, plus properties, a total of 20 million. But their formal offer, three months later after that, is for £1 enterprise value for a substantial business, which Lloyds file notes describe as strong enterprise value. Moreover, Premier has enjoyed record income in 2008. And quite unusually, they were to pay all business critical creditors, thereby enabling the business simply to carry on before. Anyhow, not to be beaten, I introduce a competitor to introduce funds and return the overdraft to as was before Warnett arrived. Lloyds will have no equity, and PwC's input effectively ended. Proof of funds arrive, and the deal makes it clear that administration is not only undesirable but unnecessary. However, an email sent to the competitor informs them how to change the deal, which will involve administration, and telling them to send an amended deal to
ian.d.green@uk.pwc. The deal is then changed to reflect Project TOC, and now give Lloyds 15% equity share in the company. I'm now advised by company lawyers that without the support of Premier, the Lloyds' support to Premier, there's nowhere to go other than administration, and it must cease trading. So given the above, there is no explanation other than this was a deliberate plan, a setup or a scam, if you will, to increase the borrowings, get control, then demand repayment by a rapid sale of the company in order that Lloyds would obtain by breakup an excellent cash-producing company on the cheap, and PwC gained significant extra fees by eliminating the owner, shareholder, and any associated costs. Irving Warnett, the PwC director, was a Trojan horse, and the DVLA separation of funds matter was just the trigger for the action. Individuals were conspiring to obtain the company, and this timeline of facts proves the evidence. Premier was a profitable company, valuable and well run, with a substantial government contract. And the fact of the matter is I was a willing seller of the company, but my price was too high and had to be reduced. And the company lawyers, Walker Morris, if you will, confirmed to me that this was a conspiracy and there was a plan to exclude me and buy on the cheap. In short, this was a confiscation of the company's an abuse of position, or simply corruption. And BSU then confirmed that they had a target of 55 enhanced returns similar to Premier. And it transpired that Warnett and Green shared the same secretary all along, and PwC would go on to delete all Warnett's emails. Duncan Parks, the head of BSU, had also been heavily involved throughout. Now, the matters following administration. It was incredibly hard, but I was fortunate enough to eventually raise 10 million of litigation funding for a liquidator to commence proceedings against Lloyds and PwC for professional negligence, breach of contractual and fiduciary duty, fraudulent misrepresentation, causing loss by unlawful means, and conspiracy to injure. So the case passed a few smell tests. However, both defendants used every trick in the book, particularly being successful at appeal to render our ATE after the event litigation insurance invalid. And the liquidator confirms, in addition, we were faced with a regrettable destruction by both defendants, meaning that only limited documents relating to their key individuals were available for trial. The civil case was then abandoned under suspicious circumstances by the liquidator when PwC made an offer that would be withdrawn if not accepted. That offer remains confidential upon the insistence of Lloyds and PwC, and the liquidator currently will not engage over this matter at all. And finally, moreover, I took Lloyds to court over non-performance under a data protection DSAR request. I won part of the claim, with Lloyds having to pay the cost, but they did eventually produce more data, but refused to search for my personal data from 6 senior directors, who are Diana Brightmore Armour, CEO Corporate Banking, who's now left, Richard Gossage, co-CEO Corporate Markets, now left, John Maltby, Commercial Group Director, now left, Duncan Parks, MD of Business Support, now left and works for himself as DDS Advisory, Ted Regan, Chief Credit Officer, Global Corporate Markets, and Mark Stokes, Large Corporates. Lloyds was successful in persuading the judge that as they'd spent over £100,000 in searches and costs, then any more searching was disproportionate. And if you see Elliott v. Lloyds, you'll see the case. So as you would expect, the matter does not stop there, but that's the Simply Update position. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is an actual example of how they go about it and the money that's thrown at it when I was very fortunate to get 10 million of funding package.
Keith, thank you very much indeed for sharing that horrific account. It must have been an absolute nightmare. We are hopefully going to have time later on to just share and discuss ideas around the points being raised by all of our speakers, but to try to keep the time, we're going to move straight on to our next speaker. Before we do that, before we go to Francis May, let's show our appreciation to Keith for very bravely and very honestly sharing his account of what's happened. Thank you very much indeed, Keith. Well done, sir. Well done. It's truly tragic. You know, we all kind of grow up with this idea of Mannering, the Dad's Army bank manager. That's what a bank's like, or that's what they're like, we think. But clearly that's not the case.
I have to say, when this kicked off, when I found out, I thought, not a problem. You talk to the directors, you talk to the senior partners, and they come down like a ton of bricks on the individuals. As somebody said earlier on, the trouble with this is you always expect individuals to pull a fast one to do whatever. What you don't expect is the senior directors and the regulators to cover up. They're actually twice as bad as the people who have been doing the crimes.
Thank you, Keith. What you just said sort of sets out exactly why the Transparency Task Force is just growing and growing and growing. There are so many people out there who've had these kind of experiences. Thank you very much, Keith. Let's go straight to Frances May, and please do listen attentively to Frances's message. I think what she's about to say is especially important. Let me just leave it at that. Frances, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. Over the last 8 years, I have worked closely with women who, either in their own right or as partners in a family business, were targeted and became the victims of Lloyds Bank asset theft frauds. It is beyond doubt that the impact on women, children, families, and their mental health has been an ordeal without precedent in modern times. Women were seen by Lloyds as easy targets. That is, women in business, whether their businesses were large or small, women running their own operations were seen as easier to destabilize and swifter to default in order to seize their assets. Women in family partnerships, the bank would bankrupt the husband and then use aggressive litigation tactics against the wife, knowing that the husband would now have no standing in court. Women in agriculture were targeted. Lloyds and its two associated secondary lenders, UK Acorn Finance and Commercial First, have been targeting farming businesses since early in the 1980s, some of which were run by women or were inherited by women. Lloyds also targeted socially vulnerable women and women who were caring for elderly relatives. In other words, people they perceived were vulnerable. This has been a violation of human rights. In 1950, the European Convention on Human Rights was enacted, and 30 years later, in 1979, the UN Convention regarding discrimination against women. Together, these established new international standards which countries should observe internationally. Through their abuse of the legal system, corruption of the rule of law, and the range of other actions, Lloyds Banking Group and its professional agents have violated both as far as women are concerned. By thoroughly corrupting legal process, for example, Lloyds violated Article 6 of ECHR, the right of everyone to a fair trial. Moving on, the Lloyds modus operandi includes abuse of the legal system, including redaction, falsification and destruction of evidence, signature and document forgery, and land registry fraud. Wrongful bankruptcy to deliberately undermine targeted customers, invalidly appointed LPA receivers operating outside the law and without power of attorney. All this was done to distance Lloyds from the fraudulent actions of the receiver. Entrapment is a particularly unpleasant one to deal with, using regulatory and trade bodies to discredit targeted customers. Lloyds LPA receiver used complicit solicitors, trading standards, DEFRA and the RSPCA to put false evidence into court to secure a conviction against one customer. Reports were placed in the local press to cover up, and the actions. Reports were placed in the local press to cover up the actions of Lloyds and their receiver. In other instances, Lloyds receivers and solicitor have used the NHS to take the victim's capacity and their legal right to represent themselves in court. Another mode has been fraudulent misrepresentation and perjury in court. There have been serious mental health issues as a result of Lloyds' mistreatment of customers. Financial problems, it's well known, are linked to anxiety and stress. Lloyds deliberately accentuated the stress to its victims, knowing the harm which would be done. And the consequences that women have suffered are as follows. Depression and post-traumatic stress disorders are well known. Psychological abuse has been used to destabilise, discredit and bring down targeted customers. Coercive control and threats used by lawyers such as aggressive lawyers such as TLT. Mistreatment where women are concerned of whistleblowers such as Sally Masterton, the renowned HBOS whistleblower who was severely mistreated by Lloyds. What is particularly disturbing is Lloyds' sponsorship of mental health charities. This is deeply hypocritical. Since 2017, Lloyds sponsored mental health charities. Antonio Horta Osorio was seen in the press, photographed, while its professional agents have caused untold mental trauma through their own illegal actions. The consequences for the victims and their families can only be described as tragedy has been heaped on tragedy. Divorce. Previously happy long-term relationships have been broken under the strain of Lloyds' mistreatment of customers. Secondly, independent and hard-working people have lost not only their livelihoods, but in losing their assets, their pension provision, leaving them vulnerable in later years. Family breakup has been common. In 2016, the Domestic Abuse Act came in under Theresa May, and tragically, we have instances of domestic abuse which have occurred within families as a direct consequence of Lloyds' mistreatment and criminal fraud. There's also the intergenerational harm. The impact on families when they lose their homes has led to children self-harming and adolescents taking overdoses. Young adults are so distressed by what has happened to their homes and their parents, they no longer make contact with their parents. At the very bottom of the scale, we have destitution. We know of victims who once had thriving businesses and happy families who have lost literally everything and are left without homes, without families, and living in caravans belonging to friends. And again, it has been cited by Mike McGarth, suicides have been the final tragedy for many. I do say many because it's not a few, that's for sure. This presentation has been taken from the full report of this title, which I completed in June this year, and it's available under additional press releases on our website. And I will also ask Andy if it can be put up onto the TTF website. So thank you all for listening. Thank you very much.
Francis, it's us that are clearly thanking you. A couple of quick points before we swiftly move on. Thank you so much for delivering such a clear, compelling, humane account of the issues that you've raised so brilliantly. We've never had anybody speaking about those particular matters from that particular perspective before. By the way, Francis, later in the year, we have our first ever Females for Fairer Finance event, and my colleague Alexandra will pop you an email about that to see if you'd like to present again, because that was absolutely first class. Let's all please thank Francis. Thank you very much, Francis. Thank you. And not only thank her, let's try to do something to coalesce some energy and some campaigning around the issues that she has so brilliantly given account of. Thank you, Francis. We're now going to go straight to Chandila, then to Paul Carlier, then to Robert Kibbler. We'll probably be finishing the speeches, or the presentations rather, by about 8:10, but we're going to keep the channel open till 8:30, or maybe even a bit longer, because I know there's lots of you that have things you'd like to share. So Chandila, to you, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andy. Essentially, I looked at this in a very objective light. Some people probably won't like what's written here, but it's more about sitting on the other side of the table and how we are treated. So my late father was a lawyer for 50 years. And the irony of it is that as a lawyer, he found himself at the hands of Lloyds Banking Group after 35 years in practice. So you'll see why claimants fail. Keith's story is quite extraordinary, and there are other people like Keith who've been able to get to court. But once you're at court, you're likely to run out of funds, representation, and/or energy. In most cases, the debates are essentially about your strategy, even if you have very detailed insights. If you take the Noel Edmonds equation after subsequently being settled, I say a self-preservation society because ultimately a lot of people did assist Noel with where he got to, and then he left. The other aspect that we have to remember when you're looking at claims, generally is you've got to be realistic in terms of consequential and reflective loss. I will caveat that with this. Ultimately, the bank will throw everything it possibly can at a loss adjuster to work out as to how they can reduce the size of your claim, even if you're successful. There is also, I'd say, fundamentally a need to understand, much like Professor Llewellyn spoke about individuals and institutions, regulatory and supervisory bodies are often misunderstood. And sadly, many of us, I don't say this in a slight to anyone on this call, that we are not financially literate to the extent of what the instruments that some of these institutions have used. We have been as a result of going through the process. So securitization, re-securitization is a massive subject, but in a nutshell, what the bank was able to do, I've listed this and I'll make this available, was to basically take things as Mike has described and others have described and basically keep reinsuring it and then selling the exposure to somebody else at repeated individuals at your expense. So what that really means in practical terms is if something's worth 100, as Mike has said, it can be worth up to anywhere between 5 and 6 million. And every time there's a gap, you're on the hook for it. So I won't spend too much time on this because it gets very complicated, other than to say Governor Andrew Bailey, his career has charted this entire process. So as far as we can see, Mike and I have spent a considerable amount of time on this. There is a clear correlation between specific points in his career with the creation of various different instruments to satisfy bank liquidity and capital adequacy regimes. So here's a claimant's pragmatic resolution. And I say this and I stick this out there because this is born out of so many conversations and bits of feedback that we've had, and my own experience of, in respect to my late father, going through the BBRS and where we're at the moment. You know, the idea of an award probably has a limit of 650,000. So clearly for the likes of Keith, Harold Tillman and others who had hugely substantive businesses, Julia Ben-Shaka, this is probably not even worth the paper it's written on, but that's a material reality. But the two things that we had hoped would essentially be principal considerations for anything in relation to the BBRS was comprehensive debt forgiveness and restoration of credit profiles. For anyone who doesn't know, as a consequence of being involved with my father's practice for the last 12 years, I have not been able to have a decent credit profile, more simply have a current account that I can operate to use direct debit mandates. I can say, as of last week, 12 years on, I have got one, but for 12 years, it was impossible. Going on to a claimant's landscape, what you're really after is leverage. The fact that you have things like the TTF as part of a support network, looking at RBS, the Lloyds Banking Group per se, and your schemes and possibilities for redress. The biggest challenge is a claimant is stuck in the middle without any form of leverage. You go down the legal route, you need to have the money, or you need to be juicy enough as a case for a lawyer to want to take it, or to think that they can actually get somewhere with it. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. If you look at the BBRS per se, this is extremely simplistic, but not a people know this. There are 2 stages to the BBRS before you even get into the point of making your case. And one is, yes, you sign up, then you're assigned a case champion, and then there is another application for eligibility. Namely, do you satisfy their criteria? And if you have been through the process to any form of other redress, whether that be the courts, the FARs, the FCA, you are likely to be ineligible, irrespective of the size of your business. And it's important to note that they are non-binding decisions. The banks can actually appeal them. And if you're deemed ineligible, it is sadly tough luck. Moratoriums, this is quite serious for many people. William has raised this as well. You are trying to get into the BBRS, but at the same time, the principal creditor, whether it's Lloyds and other secured creditors, will be chasing you. So it's almost impossible to enter the process, to get through their application process, to get to the point of preparing a case, if at the same time you're being pursued by those creditors externally. That happens in the context of the BBRS. They don't have an opinion on moratoriums, as it physically says in the slide, but you have to understand that the moratorium has not been fully thought through. I had a call last week with my business champion, and she said she needed to go and find out what that actually meant. So case summaries. This sounds really extraordinary as it is simplistic. You have to be able to get your case across in 4 to 5 lines. That's essentially just a synopsis of what happened to us in terms of my late father. But that really is the key to actually unlocking your own set of circumstances. It is very difficult otherwise. Everyone has hugely traumatic circumstances with nuances, but you have to be able to condense your problem into 4 or 5 lines. It is difficult to do, but I would recommend you try to do it. So using my father's late middle name, I came up with this. People may agree, disagree, think it's rubbish. It doesn't matter. In terms of the gladiator principle, I would say that you have to look at something like what Professor Llewellyn said about individuals, albeit the institution versus the individual is the greatest challenge. If you go after a board member or particular board member who has oversight on a regulation, compensation, or overarching governance for a board, you have to then see who is more vulnerable within that board relative to the individual. So do you, for example, in the past, many people have tried to pursue Antonio Horta Osorio. That is quite challenging for many reasons, both through the civil and criminal courts, very difficult, both on cost and in terms of evidence. MPs are very useful. They do help. They do write letters of support. They do get involved. Not all, because obviously they have an enormous inbox and various things to deliver. So the challenges are there. And also, there is concurrently at the moment, something worth following is the Oliver Morley versus RBS and his successive attempts to go to the High Court and what he's doing in relation to that, and why Mike and I spent an incredible amount of time looking at Andrew Bailey in that regard as well. So conclusions, there is an element that the bank will think that we're all out for ourselves and our families, which is understandable. At the same time, I don't blame anyone if they're in that situation, because for many people, this has taken over 12 years, some people 15 years. There is a challenge in terms of attacking the wrong institution and the individuals, because you have to find a way, if you are going down the legal route, to pin it on a person. That is incredibly difficult. I think some MPs, as I've said before, are a bit disengaged because ultimately claimant fatigue and the exceptions exist. But the reality is you have to deal with what you've got. And I think on the BBRS, the best result that many of us could get is to be considered eligible and for it to be a repository for evidence. In other words, many of the things that people have raised on this call, including William and Francis, if you start sending that kind of information in, it becomes very difficult for them to turn around and say, well, you know, we can't believe that this happened. I had several gasps during my call with the BBRS saying, did that really happen? Whether the individual believes it, whether they're true to their word, that will remain to be seen. But in essence, the asset protection scheme, if we can have a really good handle on that and how that was applied and how that was created, then many of us will be able to reach a resolution in terms of understanding how we fit it into the jigsaw. Culture, how banks operate, shareholder value, etc. That is all party to that. And Lloyds, in its own right, decided to exit it because it worked out it could make more money. Beyond that, thank you.
Chandila, that was extremely interesting. What a thoughtful and clear and creatively put together presentation. Chandila, let's hear more from you in due course. Please, let's all show our thanks to Chandila for that. That was very thought-provoking indeed. We must speak further with you, Chandila. I really liked your forensic way of looking at things. We're going to go straight to Mr. Paul Carlier now, and then we're going to be going to our final speaker, who is Robert Kibbler, and then we'll kind of throw it open for Q&A. Stick around if you want to, obviously depart if you need to, no problem at all. Mr. Paul Carlier. Paul's got so much knowledge and experience, he could talk for hours and hours, and literally has done in the past. It's been engaging every single minute of it. But as you know, Paul, we need to be as short and sweet as you can. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to be quick. Keith has covered quite a few points already regarding Packham and the fact that this was a business model. So I'm going to skip through as many as I can. I want these slides to be visible, so I might skip through them, but they'll be recorded and people can go back and look at them after the event. So, this is the key. What you see is not a series of random acts or the work of a few rogue individuals. This was a business model. Okay, this and Keith's already touched upon quite a few things. So I'm going to just press forward. Okay, so many of you may be aware, Stephen Pegg was appointed to the board of BBRS end of last year. He was a former director of Lloyds Banking Group's SME markets business. And in my 28-year career on bank trading floors, the single worst business unit I ever came across in terms of raping and pillaging SMEs and fraud. Now, Stephen Pegg appeared in a BBC Panorama programme with Andy Verity in 2014 called Did the Bank Wreck My Business? Difficult to find, but this link here will take you to it. And I've had reason to watch this again in recent weeks. And it's astonishing, given what we now know since 2014, since this was broadcast. When you look at this programme now, against the backdrop of what we now know, it's astonishing how many false representations Pegg makes within this programme. And particularly, he states, and this is word for word, if we undervalue a property, and indeed, if a property is sold for less than it's worth, we'd just be increasing the losses eventually on that particular situation for the bank. False. And he must have known this when he was making the representation. Or if he did not know this was false, then he should not have been making a declaration for the public record, having not checked his facts. It's an incorrect representation, whether made falsely or through lack of knowledge. The bank is like a magician creating an illusion. They get you to focus on the left hand so that you don't look at or notice what the right hand's doing. Now, a few examples of how exactly the destruction and undervalue Lloyds used to its benefit. Now, the Ashwell Property Group, I'm going to try and whiz through, as I say. In 2007, this had assets valued at 300 million against debt of 150 million. Fast forward 2 years, and the land bank it had a 2 billion asset value upon completion. Fast forward 2 years and step forward, David Crawshaw and KPMG brought in to do an IBR, an independent business report, and Crawshaw and KPMG saw to it the assets were downvalued, and not just downvalued, but slashed by 50%, including, and this is sources that were close to this case have told me, that he put a £0 value on a massive development site that they owned and that had under development adjacent to Cambridge Station, a site that the industry at the time had confirmed would be worth 800 million upon completion. So for that snapshot in time, they put a zero valuation on it. Into administration you go. And within the first week, Crawshaw had sold the business for £3 million to a company called Brookgate Limited. Brookgate was a completely new co, and it was 92% owned by Lloyds. 3 years later, Lloyds sold their stake in that business for a 300 million profit. So let's, Mr. Pegg, talk to you about, undervaluation or downvaluation is not in the business interest. But importantly, the loss that they would have seemed to have suffered by the sale of Ashwell, we'll look at over here, and this is what they'll tell you about. But what you don't see is 300 million profit they made subsequently later on, or what I refer to as a consequential profit. So they'll quite happily show you the losses in one hand, say, oh, look, we lost, and why would we do this to ourselves? It's absolute nonsense, because in the consequential profit that they make later on is 300 million, but you don't get to see that. And that's smoke and mirrors. And incidentally, the law firm that represents Brookgate Limited, Herbert Smith Freehills. You've already heard of them tonight, and this won't be the last time you hear from them from me. All about the Easter Group, another business customer of Lloyds Bank, forced into the BSU and yet again forced to accept David Crawshaw and KPMG as Trojan horses. The bank and Crawshaw made one claim after another that the business wasn't viable. Each time the business, very experienced executives came up with a solution. And every time they came up with a solution, the bank just changed the question. In the end, Easter Group brokered a deal with Schroeder Property Fund, where the fund would purchase a prime industrial estate from Easter Group for 23.5 million, but allow the Easter Group to retain ownership of development land that was within the title, and even offered Easter Group a lucrative management contract to manage the estate. Easter proposed to use the proceeds to pay down their Lloyds debt, solve all alleged issues, and free them to walk away from LBG. Win, win, win. However, because of the rights the bank had sought to engineer, they needed Lloyds and Crawshaw to agree. They took an age to respond and eventually refused to sanction the deal. Easter Group forced into administration, and this same industrial estate was sold by Crawshaw, who had naturally been appointed to the role of administrator, for £18 million, and that included the development land. The law firm that represents the new owners of that estate, Herbert Smith Freehills. So I'm going to skip through the next ones. These are all slides that are relevant to the Matt Packham balance scorecard, which is basically the annual review of each employee at Lloyds. Okay, and there's other documents in here as well, but this is all relevant to the business model described by Keith earlier. But I want to jump forward to a key. I'll pause it briefly so that you can see them on the playback. But this is the most damning one. Okay, the Packham's documentation confirms that they trained the BSUs nationwide to make them aware of how to generate value, thereby increasing the equity value of the business and impact the Lloyds business and impacting the profitability of our stakes in the business. And particularly, and this is incredibly important, by way of entry pricing, buying the business at low value. How do you do that? You depress the value of the asset. So you then convert more of your debt into a greater amount of equity than you otherwise should. So this was a strategic part of the business model, and completely destroys what Peg said in that interview with Andy Verity. So somebody still needs to tell me, and I've challenged the BBRS as to how Peg can possibly be on that board when he was a director of SME markets, the business unit that was responsible probably more than any other for selling toxic swaps to customers, most of whom will now be coming before the BBRS. So many of you may have seen my presentation before regarding the Angel Group, but we do have this case with the Serious Fraud Office. They are still 2 years on reviewing things. They won't announce a formal investigation, and incredibly, they will make the decision as to whether or not to launch an investigation without ever having contacted the accused and asking them to comment. Instead, they rely entirely upon the evidence presented by victims. Fortunately, in this case, Julia Davey has substantial evidence, and we even have criminal opinions from a barrister who's an advisor to the CPS on fraud cases, confirming that there is fraud and conspiracy to defraud here. But she's in the minority because, as you know, if you're destroyed as a business, you lose all rights, you lose all access to information and evidence, and the bank sits on all the evidence, but is never asked to produce it or defend themselves by the SFO. They'll just review the case based on what you give them. Sorry, nothing to see here, move on. Now, in this article that was in the Telegraph, a Lloyds spokesperson made two outrageous statements, one of which was denying everything, saying that Miss Davies' companies had significant debts that had expired or been in default for more than 2 years, and a restructuring was attempted. False representation. In 2009, when this alleged default occurred, the Angel Group had an LTV of 53%. 53%, way within the covenant, never missed a payment and never breached any of the covenants. And 2 days before, they'd been trying for months and months and months to get the bank to agree this new facility. And 2 days before, Philip Simpson of HBOS Relationship Manager, on a recorded call, tells the group, I'm going to get a 3-month extension on the present basis because I think the valuation exercise is going to take some time. So that's my intention anyway. Everything will just carry on as normal. After the facility expired, no one can get hold of Simpson. It's not until the 5th of November that they finally get hold of him. And now he says responsibility for the Angel Connect is going to pass out of my hands to the real estate team based in London. And here we see down here, it's what they call their business support unit. So there you go, you're into the abattoir. And what they would, once they were in there, the BSU claimed that the justification for moving them into BSU was that they defaulted. They denied that they said that the extension hadn't been approved, when in actual fact, a year later, in a document dated a year later, there's a statement in there that Angel's facility has been extended internally. The extension of Angel's facility has not been documented with the company, which remains in default. So they lied. They faked a default, that they did extend the facility. The business should never have gone into BSU, and had it not gone into BSU, it would never have been destroyed, and it would have survived and thrived. Okay, another thing that the Lloyds spokesperson said in that article, again trying to paint Julia Davey in a picture as though they were justified. He said a High Court judgment in 2018 concluded that the company's management must have believed Angel Group was at risk of immediate insolvency from at least June 2011. And the reason they said that is because she took a dividend of just under £11 million, mostly by way of property, from the business in June 2011. And they said that's because she must have been believed the business was insolvent. This claim was brought by Deloitte, who have so far been funded to the tune of 13 million in legal costs by Lloyds Bank. And yet they knew this was a false claim, okay, because they've got the evidence that we've got, okay? And basically, in January 2010, Miss Davies' new lawyers tell her that she's entitled to take a substantial dividend, but if you look at the bottom here, ideally, dividends should not be declared until Julia has established non-resident status with HMRC, because she just moved to Israel. So they were saying, don't take it now, wait until we establish what your domicile is. So it's not until October 2010 that finally the accountants write back and say, delighted to say that it's been declared that your residency will be in Israel, where she had moved to. However, they then go on to say, in order to be doubly safe, it's best to wait until the next tax year before taking your dividend, okay? And that's exactly what she did in June 2011, all the time acting on this professional advice. Now, so they came after her for this £11 million, saying that she basically asset stripped her own company, when it was nonsense. She was taking a dividend she had every right to take in January 2010 for previous year's earnings, okay? And she acted entirely on professional advice. Who was the accountancy firm giving the advice? A firm called McBride's. Who were McBride's? They were a firm that evolved from a company by the name of Vantis. Vantis were a firm that found itself in BSU. And whilst in BSU and other cases that I'm now aware of, they appear to have undertaken some rather questionable work on behalf of the bank. So were they trying to keep the business in funds so that she wouldn't be able to take the money out? Was it a part of the strategy with Lloyds? We don't know. But it's unquestionable that they were solely responsible. And indeed, as soon as she was forced into bankruptcy, the trustees appointed as her trustee in bankruptcy went after McBride's and got a £5 million settlement. Well, how can McBride's, the accountants, be responsible as well as her? They deliberately didn't go after McBride's because they wanted to go after her, try and paint the picture that she was guilty, knowing full well that it was the accountants that were guilty. And we've got all this evidence, and so did Deloitte and so did Jones Day, their lawyers, when they brought this claim. It was an absolute disgrace. They knew that it was a false claim, but they knew that her lawyer, who she had at the time, had not made submission of a witness statement in time, and she wouldn't have the opportunity to defend herself in court. Absolutely staggering. Now I mentioned her trustee in bankruptcy. So having got this dividend judgment, it put Lloyds in the position of the biggest creditor. So they instructed Deloitte that to force on her an independent trustee in bankruptcy. So they picked Kevin Hellard, director of Grant Thornton, represented by Moonbeaver, senior partner Francis Coulson, who just happens to be a special constable for the National Crime Agency. Now, we allege that Grant Thornton were entirely conflicted. And so Kevin Hellard, as a senior partner, must be entirely conflicted and couldn't take this role. However, he signed a declaration for a High Court document saying that there was no conflict of interest whatsoever, and he was free to take on this role. However, this email you see here, this is an email from somebody who works for Baronsmead Consulting, the Trojan Horse business turnaround company forced on Julia whilst in BSU. And you see on here, there's one of the people that's addressed as Russell Simpson, contractor. So who is Russell Simpson, who then obviously subsequently sends an email regarding this business that's in BSU. It's a company called Milecare Professional Homes. So who is Russell Simpson? Okay, well, it turns out he's a Grant Thornton secondee. So this man is a Grant Thornton secondee working in the Suffolk Lane Business Support Unit, the same business support unit where Julia's company was being managed. He was working with the same business turnaround company that conspired with Lloyds to force her into administration. And he says there's no conflict. Well, and what happened to my old Professional Homes then, the case that this Grant Thornton secondee was working in? Well, surprise, surprise, they end up in administration. And who gets appointed administrator? Funnily enough, David Dunkley. Who's David Dunkley? He's the current CEO of Grant Thornton LLP UK. So there we have another case where the accountancy firm appointed as advisors by Lloyds BSU, they work on the case, that company again ends up in administration, and that accountancy company gets rewarded with the lucrative administration role. And let's not forget, he is now the CEO of Grant Thornton UK. Kevin Hellard, Julia's trustee in bankruptcy, reports directly to him. Hellard's the head of insolvency. There's no way he did not know Grant Thornton had people on the ground in that business support unit. There's no way he did not know that he was entirely conflicted. So, and look at this. In his report, Dunkley confirms that he's agreed a fee of 1.5 million to act as administrator for that Mole Professional Homes, the very company forced into administration and that one of his secondees had worked on. Now, how can Hellard possibly claim he was not conflicted, right? Julia Davey, as a bankrupt, had a cause of actions against Lloyds, BSU, KPMG and Baronsmead. Hellard, getting forced upon her as independent trustee in bankruptcy by Deloitte, funded by Lloyds, became solely responsible for pursuing these claims on her behalf. Was he going to pursue claims against Lloyds, BSU, KPMG and Baronsmead when those claims would expose his employer and his ultimate boss for being a party to the same conduct? Of course he wasn't, and he hasn't, because it's unquestionable that he was and is entirely conflicted. But incredibly, he and his lawyer, Francis Coulson of Moonbeaver, are adamant that this does not represent a conflict of interest. Now, somebody's got to tell me how that's the case, because that is a definition of a conflict of interest. So let's move on. Andrew Bailey. Andrew Bailey was sent at the end of 2018 all the evidence that we had. We articulated it, we presented it in black and white. Julia's MP sends it to Andrew Bailey, and this is the third rebuttal that Bailey sends back. First of all, he claims that he can't, the FCA can't get involved because she had a judgment against her in 2018. We had to get a criminal lawyer to point out what hell of a difference does that make? That this judgment, that even if it had been obtained lawfully, which it wasn't, how does that basically excuse the bank for things they did from 2009 onwards? It's nonsense. So we submitted that report from the lawyer, and Bailey comes back with this, trying to claim that most of it's outside of the remit, okay? And to this day, nothing has been done by the FCA. We've identified 54 counts of wrongdoing and or fraud. I would say at least half of it falls within the FCA's remit, and yet nothing is being done. So I'll skip past this one here, but basically they forced her into administration in 2012, claiming that she didn't have enough money to pay a £100,000 British gas bill in October 2012. Okay, this was entirely false. So in the day before that this British gas bill was due, and some of you may have seen this before in the previous presentation, we've got emails behind the scenes thanks to a whistleblower. This is where we've got this evidence from. And for weeks before this October 12th deadline, okay, to pay British Gas 100,000, Lloyds, Cameron McKenna, KPMG, Baronsmead, they're all conspiring to get these invoices together so that the day before this was due, they could basically take 189 grand out of the business account of Angel Group, leaving them 35,000 short of the amount needed to pay British Gas the next day. I mean, it's staggering. Okay, that is absolutely staggering. We've got all the emails, and that's all with the SFO as well. However, the worst part of this is that when they were claiming that the business didn't have the money to pay its fees, we had this group that they knew that there was £947,000 of the business's money sitting in this account, which is an internal Lloyds Bank wash account that doesn't sit, that the business doesn't have oversight of, doesn't have control of. They had siphoned off money from property sales that should have gone to the business account, that the statement you saw on the previous slide, but instead they diverted it to this internal wash account. And the reason being, the business was so bloody cash generative, they couldn't get the business into administration without siphoning off. And over the course of that year, they put £2 million in there from property sales. We've sent this to the FCA with a dossier, and because Herbert Smith came back with a response finally last year, and we were able to destroy that with evidence that we hadn't actually disclosed. So we've defeated and proved false representations made by Herbert Smith, defeated their positions, sent that to the FCA. We've also forwarded to the SFO. And Martin Kosmicki of the executive complaints team, who acts on behalf of the FCA, said a bank may use funds held in an account with the bank to pay off debt, i.e. take it from an account, if the account holder has agreed to it or the terms of the account permits it. Okay, that's great. But one thing that doesn't exist, there's no authorization. There's an actual overdraft on the business account that demands these property sales and the proceeds from it all go into the business account. They can't be diverted anywhere else. And we've got emails proving that by Lloyds employees proving they should have been transferred to the business account, but were not. And but for that, that's money laundering. That went to a third-party account, and but for that, the business would have survived and thrived.
Well, what we're going to do, Paul, what we're going to do now, we're going to go to Robert for his quick talk, and then we're going to come back to you to finish off with your piece. Okay.
Okay.
Just hold it there if you could, Paul. Yeah. I'm just trying to manage time as best as I can for everybody. So, Mr. Robert Kibbler, can you please take the floor, as it were? So take yourself off mute, and then we'll go to Paul Carlier after you finish your session. Robert, over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Andy.
You're welcome.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Robert Kibbler, and I'm a victim of Lloyds Bank mandate, fraud and concealment. In 2009, I had a contracting business and with a business partner, and we were both authorised signatories required on the bank mandate. My co-director and signee decided to approach the relationship manager and increased a telepay facility for the wages. I had no idea that this had been requested, and I only found out after the transaction had happened, and obviously then made a complaint to the relationship manager, who said he would come back to me and never did. Within 3 months, we had to place the company into liquidation because of the flow of cash that had gone out. The liquidator I furnished with all the information, with all the documentation, it's all in black and white, did absolutely nothing about it. And I then took it upon myself to start investigating further. Found out that a company with an almost similar name had been set up by one of the other directors, who was not on the banking, and a subcontractor. And obviously the work from the company started to flow away. All this information, as I say, given to the liquidator, nothing. I eventually got a bit fed up and took upon myself to correspond with Lloyds, at which point they told me to go away. I was not entitled to any information. So I then wrote to them and told them that they actually caused the liquidation of the company and that they owed me a direct loss as a personal guarantor. I wrote to them over a year of correspondence, which they didn't respond to any of it. So I issued a statutory demand in 2019. And within, I think it was about 3 days before that statutory demand could be stamped, I had a call from their lawyer, Ben Hay, of Foot Anstey, telling me that they were going to get an injunction against me, and then they would charge me £50,000 for the privilege. I did point out to them that they hadn't given me the correct notice, and that I would oppose it. So he went away, came back within a day and said, look, if you agree to withdraw this, we'll have a meeting. And I agreed to it. They paid the costs. And a couple of months later, I went to Foot Anstey's office in Bristol, took my son along as a witness, and I had to get the liquidator and his manager to attend as well, for authority to be able to speak and question Lloyds Bank. At the meeting in 2019, there was a man there by the name of Andy Hobbs. Andy Hobbs introduced himself as the senior litigation manager for Lloyds Bank. Also there was an area director by the name of Gary Short and the solicitor, Benjamin Hay. At that meeting, I couldn't understand as to why I couldn't get any information, and even with the liquidator sitting there. This was all in black and white. It was a clear breach of a bank mandate, or, you know, it's all recorded. So I asked Andy Hobbs, who I found to be quite an arrogant man, if anybody had a contract with Lloyds Bank and the person with the contract, the customer, did anything wrong. I said, what would you do to them? I said, would you financially annihilate them? And he said, yes, of course. I said, oh, Okay. I said, so what if it's the other way around, as in somebody has contracts with Lloyds Bank and Lloyds Bank makes a mistake or does something wrong? Do you put your hands up and say sorry? And he went, no, we don't do anything like that. We can do what we like. Now, at the same meeting, I then asked the question as well regarding key logging. Now, I'm sure a lot of people will have had the experience where Lloyds turn around and say they can't find documentation. It's been lost. It's years old. It's untraceable. Well, key logging is every single button that is pressed on a computer, on any PC, within the whole organisation is fully traceable. Now, I've passed all my information on to the BBRS, and I was talking to Mike the other day, and I say it as it is. I found the two ladies that I'm dealing with there to be very helpful. They turned around and told me I have a case, which hopefully I do have, and I hopefully do. I do feel that they will help me to get a resolution in this to move on. Because all this sort of happened to me in 2009 when I was looking after my elderly parents who both had serious dementia. And the relationship manager at Lloyds, he knew all about this. You know, we had in constant contact all the time. And my co-directors obviously took the opportunity to basically get me out of the business, destroy the business, and start a new one up and reap the rewards of it. So in my mind, I've never recovered mentally from this because this was intentional. It's concealed, obviously concealed by Lloyds. And for them to turn around and especially say that I'm not allowed to have the information, you know, imagine it's completely destroyed. And there's lots and lots of people since I thought I was the only victim with Lloyds Bank until I sort of bumped into Mike through different channels. And thanks, Mike, by the way, you've been extremely supportive to me. And there's lots and lots of people out there who really do need that bit of help, that bit of guidance and support to maybe get these people who run these banks to understand the difference between right and wrong and what damage that they actually do to people and to families. Anyway, thank you for listening.
Robert, we're all very grateful to you for sharing your thoughts. Withholding your information from you, knowing that you would be able to use it to prove your case is like, it's like seeing somebody drowning. It's like seeing a helpless child drowning in a canal.
Yeah.
You know, 10 feet away from one of those life, you know, those buoyancy aid stands you see on next to rivers and canals, and not bothering to throw in a rope. I just can't relate to that. I don't think there's anybody on this call that can. Can we please thank Robert for sharing his experiences with us? Thank you, Robert. And we're going to jump back to Paul Carlier. We've kind of finished the formalities of this, but I'm going to carry on if others want to carry on. So, Paul Carlier, please just do pick up from where you got to, and thank you so much to all the very many speakers who've contributed to tonight's session. We have to, and I've said this before, I'm going to say it again. We as a community have to find ways to combine our energy, our insight, our experience, our proof, our evidence, our leverage over whatever we've got to try to make what needs to happen. We need to basically exorcise parts of our financial system. It's very obvious to me and all of you that there are parts of our financial system that are frankly rotten to the core. Just like Professor Llewellyn was saying, this is a cultural thing. This is people behaving very badly in an environment where it's somehow okay to do that. People being set targets to multiply productivity and achieve more sales and all the kinds of things we've heard so many times. Even even if we do work together, we've got one almighty great big struggle ahead of us. But trying to do it independently is going to be pretty difficult. We're going to go to Paul Carlier, then we'll open it up. So, Paul, if you can finish off your very good presentation as succinctly as possible, please.
Yeah,
Thank you, Paul.
Be quick. There's only about 3 or 4 more slides, I think. So, right, this is going back to this. Can you see that, everybody?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know why I can't see it. So, yeah, why can't I see it? Okay. Basically, this is during 2012. These are emails. The bank and KPMG made an aborted first attempt to force the business into administration. The same rules applied. There was still this money sitting in the wash account, so the business had plenty of funds. Now, importantly, remember what the Lloyds spokesman said about in that article by Michael O'Dwyer, said that, oh, the business has been in default for 2 years, and this judgment against Julia, etc., etc. So, okay, fine. If this this company has been in default, if you want to force them into administration, then okay, fine. You just refer to a default that occurred 2 years ago. Say, look, the bank's been really patient, but enough's enough. Into administration you go. But here we have. Can you see this? It's an email from David Crawshaw himself to the rest of his team at KPMG, and this is 2 days before the planned administration. And he says, guys, are we right in stating, and quote, unfortunately, the company no longer has the cash to make payments as they fall due, necessitating the appointment of administrators or receivers. We are working with employees to stabilise the business and will now be exploring options to sell the properties. However, it's what's next that's important. He says, I thought it was currently cash generative-ish. We need to be careful what we say here. This lady is most litigious. And underneath, he says, what defaults are we using? LTV? Would it be more correct to say that the bank following a covenant breach, the bank enforced its security, etc.? Well, he can't, because he knows there's no default. He doesn't, and when his colleague replies, she replies, the challenge is we need to come up with the reason for the administration for the media. If we don't, we'll just receive a load of calls. We don't normally make any reference to the bank in our press release. Could we say something like, unfortunately, the business had not kept up with debt obligations, they fell due, triggering the appointment of administrators, will now be exploring opportunity. They don't refer to a default in 2009, like the Lloyds Bank spokesperson did. Why? Because they know there was no bloody default. There wasn't a default. It had been faked. It would be the easiest thing to justify the administration if there'd been a default in 2009. Here we are in 2012. What more justification do you need? But the bottom line is, they can't do it. They have to come up with something else. And she's saying the challenge is we need to come up. How is it a challenge? If a genuine administration, there's no challenge. There's a genuine reason. So this is all going on behind the scenes. And this is what most people don't get to see. We've got to see it because of a whistleblower from the turnaround company who handed over their laptop, and we see all this. And this is the tip of the iceberg. There is conspiracy and collusion going on for months. So, and in the end, they come up, we need 2 versions depending on whether she cooperates or not, however unlikely. I will send something through shortly for consideration. Basically, they were trying to persuade her to go into administration voluntarily, again, by making the picture appear worse than it really was, right? But then once that didn't work, hey-ho, not to worry, we'll just cross whatever line we need to and go criminal with, to achieve our objective. No thought of changing the objective and going, all right, we tried, but let's help the business and through. No, they crossed the line. They diverted more money to that internal wash account, deprived the business of funds, and then used that to unlawfully put them into administration by all those false representations as to no money. And that's the press release they drafted. Not one mention on there about a default. Why? Because there was no bloody default. They'd faked it. KPMG knew they'd faked it, as did the bank. So. But this is not, and going back to the claims by that director or the spokesperson of Lloyds, yes, she knew her business was insolvent in 2011. That's why she took the dividend. Nonsense, because on February 23rd, 2012, just after they'd been appointed, the director of Barron's Mead and the accountant that was in Julia's office get caught on a conversation by her call recording system. And they have this, and it basically follows that Julia's manager had been complaining that why the hell do we have to pay your $4,500 a day costs when the bank wants you here? We don't need you. We're perfectly okay. We've got a great business model. We're doing well, and you're just sucking money from the company essentially. Why don't Lloyds pay you? So the Barron's Mead director says, yeah, I'm just intellectually, I'm intrigued to know where we have a conflict of interest. Right now, the conflict, there should be no conflict. If Julia's company is paying them their fees, they have to be acting entirely on behalf of Julia. They didn't. Behind the scenes, there was all this smoke and mirrors going on. Now, the Barron's Mead accountant points out, oh, they think that they can do without us, yada, yada, yada. Now, the important thing is what the Barron's Mead director says next. He says, I wish he knew how close he was to being in administration. You can't tell him. Now, everything's, anything that a bank does, if you want to avoid something happening, you tell somebody there's a risk of it happening, right? Like they do with your home is at risk if you don't keep up payments on your mortgage, right? Here, you have the Barron's Mead director who was very, very much in bed with Lloyds. He confirms that he knows the business is going into administration, but he says here, don't tell the business. And he also confirms that the business had no idea it was on the verge of administration. Again, contrary to what Lloyds tried to paint in that article and tried to say in court. They had no fear of administration. They knew they were too viable and too cash generative. But this is, I've mentioned this before in another presentation. This is an extract from a New York Department of Financial Services press release, May 20th, 2015, when they fined Barclays $2.5 billion for a multitude of wrongdoing in FX. And this is they summarize additional efforts to cheat by Barclays to cheat their clients. Hard markup is key. But I was taught early, you don't have clients, you don't make money, so don't be stupid. In other words, don't be greedy. But if you look at the middle bit here, making sure you make the right decision on price. That is, what is the worst price I can put on this where the customer's decision to trade with me or give me future business doesn't change. If you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. Now, Barclays were fined $2.5 billion because they were the only bank that had two salespeople stupid enough to have this conversation on the Bloomberg chat that was discovered. Now, but that, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying by salespeople, and that markup, make as much money as you can, that's standard. And it's been standard at every bank that I've ever worked at, every sales desk, and particularly Lloyds. Now, if you look at any pricing framework, and it was mentioned in the GIG report by Promontory, all the pricing tables had a charge up to this amount. So, and the Lloyds official formal pricing policy had the same, charge up to this amount. The reason being, try and get away with that. If you have to come down, then charge that. So in other words, it was flexibility to get to price on whatever you can get away with basis. That was a business model, industry standard, and everybody knows about it. So that concludes my piece.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. Once again, you've delivered a lot of evidence to support your very significant claims of remarkably shocking content. I'm kind of stuck for words once again, and that doesn't happen too often, but it does when you're around, Paul. Thank you very much. Let's show our thanks to Paul for preparing his presentation and delivering such compelling evidence. Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Thank you. Very, very good indeed. Okay, I can see Sebastian Leslie has got a hand up. So Sebastian, please take the opportunity to make your point. And just before you do that, I typoed in the chat just now. I think our book club event is on Thursday next week. By the way, the book club event is about a book all about the kind of predatory banking activities that we've spoken about this evening. So please do come to that. Also, we've got our session on Thursday. That's day after tomorrow, i.e. this week, about weaponization of the insolvency service. We're doing as much as we can to try to bring all this truth to the surface. Alexandra, in her note tomorrow that she'll circulate, will make all this clear. I'm talking a bit jumbled up because I'm a bit shocked at what I've been hearing. Sebastian, let's go to you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Andy, thank you very much. Guys, you won't know me. Sebastian is a councillor in Aberdeenshire. I've been chasing the Atwood report of 2011, written by Jane Atwood, who's presently head of intelligence at the FCA. I agree with much of what we said tonight, but I feel a bit like a Rangers fan at a Celtic match. My job, there are 3,000 victims in the Atwood report. It was put on to me originally by David McCletchie, the late David McCletchie, who died. There's been a significant push within Scotland, not all of them, to accept that there has been corruption by Lloyds Bank, including money laundering. I'm having incredible support from Andrew Bowie, Vice Chairman of the Scottish Conservative Party, Vice Chairman of the United Kingdom Conservative Party and my local MP as a councillor. Kevin Hollinrake, Simon Reeville were incredible 3 years ago. I lost my house. I lost that particular battle, but we haven't lost the war. I would just like to say that I'm pushing very hard. I'm working with Anthony. I spoke to him today. I'm new to this group, but I'm getting a completely different perception from what I'm here. Will May, bless him, I haven't seen him for 40 years. He was a friend of mine at Cambridge. You've all suffered a hell of a lot. I've lost a house. But my view is that it is easier to catch flies with sugar than with vinegar. We're not going to solve this problem of corruption unless we get HMG on side. And so far, I've had support from the Lord Chancellor, the Director of Public Prosecutions, and also, I don't know them, Secretary, but I also had 1 or 2 comments coming through from a number of MPs saying this has got to be dealt with. And certainly Andrew Bowie, I haven't been in touch with Kevin Hollinrake, he's not my MP, but he was very helpful about 3 years ago when I went to the Better Business Banking. They're all being very positive. So my counter view here is, rather than being derogatory about HMG and all the whole thing's falling apart, I actually think this present cabinet, particularly under Michael Gove, who's an old friend of mine, and I know him for a long time, are actually beginning to address this. It's bloody difficult. You've got corruption in the banks, corruption in accounting firms, in my view, malfeasance within the FCA, but there is a real effort. And what I'm pushing for is, rather than attacking and saying they're all hopeless and they're all corrupt, is saying, please come on side HMG, and can we get a judge like Sir David Foskett, who's already working for Lloyds Bank, on side to look after my 3,000 victims in the Atwood report and any others. So just so you all know, you're not alone. I think the stories are appalling. Frankly, I'm lucky I've got a film star daughter who looked after me when I was evicted from my house. Most people don't have that, so I was very blessed. But there is a real view, I think, in the House of Commons that this needs to be sorted. I know that's counter to the view tonight, and they're all corrupt and they're all hiding this and that. Certainly there's been corruption in politicians, corruption in bankers, corruption in lawyers, but I think there's a view that this is changing. So I just wanted to say that to you, Andy. I'm positive, I'm fighting, and so far I've met nothing but integrity and a determination to root this corruption out. And I want you all to know that. And thank you, Andy. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you for your thoughts. Okay, let's throw it open, folks.
If I may, can I just respond to Sebastian's point there? I mean,
of course you can.
Sebastian, I've had the misfortune to come across swords with Jane Atwood, and I didn't know of her existence before I got a DSAR from Lloyds and saw her name all over emails to and from about my disclosures, including disclosures about a director of group security and fraud. It was only when I looked her up on LinkedIn that I found out that she actually worked for Lloyds between January 2011 and October 2013, and was a colleague of the person in group security and fraud who I'd made disclosures about and who lied.
That's correct. That's when I went to see her. I went to see her about my problem. She ignored it.
Well, the thing is, Andrew Bailey in 2000.
Sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
That's right. Now, in 2017, now this would have been 2 years after Jane Atwood took up her post at the FCA, and presumably the report you're referring to was one that she produced when she was at Lloyds or HBOS. Would that be right, Sebastian?
I've just muted Sebastian. So Sebastian, unmute yourself.
Well, basically, Andrew Bailey was asked by the Treasury Select Committee when it was about the GRG Promontory report. He was asked, "Are you aware of any other conduct of this kind of nature anywhere else in the industry?" Bailey, and it's recorded in Hansard, said, "Beyond the 68, I think it is, victims of HBOS Reading, evidence is patchy." Now, Sebastian is here. We know that obviously there are thousands of victims in BSU Bristol. We know there's even more in Bishopsgate in London. And if Sebastian's right in saying that she's got a dossier of 3,000 odd victims, how can Bailey be testifying to that effect before the Treasury Select Committee, that the evidence is patchy?
Listen, may I come in, Chair? Have you muted me?
Yeah.
Yes, you may, but please be concise so we can share it with others as well. Thank you, Sebastian.
Yeah, certainly. No, absolutely. You're right. I'm a cynic. I'm a junior politician, but a cynic. I'm after compensation for the 3,000, 6,000, 9,000 souls who've been destroyed. I don't want to, in the process, get muddled up by somebody who's got a dodgy moral value system, by which I refer to the present Governor of the Bank of England. I mean, I put a pack into the previous Governor of the Bank of England, which was all the evidence I had, and pushed it. So I think my view is still the same, is we're not here to remove Andrew Bailey as Governor of the Bank of England. That may happen in due course when all this comes out. Our job is to get compensation. And what I'm hearing, and God forbid, I could be wrong, I could come back here in a year's time and say, sorry, chaps, they led me up the garden path. I do not believe I've been led up the garden path by Andrew Bailey, my MP. I do not believe I'm being led up the garden by one of the other two guys I've seen in the House of Lords. There is a real anger in the House of Lords, and there appears to be a view that the way forward is to put a judge in to sort this out in the same way that Sir David Foster has done it. Guys, who the hell knows? I mean, you know, I've been at this for 15 years, like many people, and I've suffered a lot less than all of you. But my view is we engage with government rather than trying to get rid of Bailey. I don't give a shit about the Governor of the Bank of England. I think he's a morally corrupt bastard, frankly. But he's not my problem. My problem is to get compensation for those souls who lost. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you. We'll go to Chandila Fernando. Chandila, thank you.
Yeah, just two things. Help is needed for people on this subject of the moratorium, because it is very serious. There are plenty of people who are trapped in a situation whereby if you're going through aid with EDRS, you need some assistance, which you have a case champion, but as I briefly mentioned, they don't quite understand the whole purpose behind a moratorium, irrespective of their comments. And secondly, in respect of not bashing government and not going after Andrew Bailey, I think we have to all understand there is a need to have essentially a pincer movement. You have to do everything. It's not that you can't focus on one thing or another. And ultimately, in terms of Andrew Bailey, there is arguably, and Mike and I have had a conversation with a couple of lawyers on this, a failure in the duty of care. Now, that may be something that people disagree with or agree with. That's a different story. But there is a very distinct angle there. Frying Andrew Bailey, I'm sure plenty of us would want to barbecue the bloke. But at this moment in time, we as claimants require some form of leverage. We don't have it. That is our biggest concern, Andy, is that in the past, lots of people have put together various disparate groups with the best of intentions. Even if we get hold of our MPs in some way, shape or form, and we present a plausible argument, we all end up running out of steam. That's the hard bit.
Thank you. These are very helpful thoughts. I'm going to share my screen to show you something which will hopefully help me explain our strategy. When I say our strategy, I mean TTF strategy. So this is the all-party parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services. It was set up last year. The Transparency Task Force is the secretariat to this APPG. So here we have myself and Mark Bishop and Sue Lewis and various other people. Sue Lewis, for example, used to be the chair of the Financial Services Consumer Panel. Mark's an incredibly knowledgeable guy. Mark and I were giving evidence in Parliament on Tuesday last week about the LCNF case. So we kind of, we're learning how to engage with the parliamentarians. Many of you know the other folks here. Paul Carlier is on this Secretariat Committee. And we've got some other people as well. And here are the parliamentarians. These are the people who have been attracted to this all-party parliamentary group. There's quite a few. And by the way, this is one of two all-party parliamentary groups that the Transparency Task Force runs. Here's Alison, she was with us earlier on tonight. Prem Seeker's, you know, a really hard-hitting campaigner for reform. But the reason I mentioned the APPG is because this is part of our strategy for driving change. So let me explain what that strategy is. Our strategy for driving change is to bring together the thinking of two types of people. On one hand, all of us on the call tonight all the 3,500 members of the Transparency Task Force around the world. And believe you me, it's taken a lot of work by me and my little team to create a community around the world of 3,500 people. We all have what we characterize as a sense of passion and purpose for the change that we want to see. But we don't have the power and the position to make the change happen. Another group has that power and position. They are the parliamentarians, the policymakers, the regulators, and we actively create opportunities to bring those two groups together and to drive change, to influence how things happen. We understand that a combination of media attention, political support, regulatory pressure, etc., that cocktail is what's needed to make real change happen, and it can be remarkably powerful. One quick example, the all-party parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services, for which the Transparency Task Force is the secretariat, we are in the next probably week or two going to be starting a call for evidence about the Financial Conduct Authority. The FCA has come up on numerous occasions at this tonight and also previous events. So this call for evidence about the FCA is a chance for everybody who's interacted with the FCA to share their thoughts about the FCA, good, bad or ugly. Could be good, bad or ugly, genuinely, it could be any of those three. And what that evidence is all going to be compiled, given to the all-party parliamentary group, and it will no doubt be a body of evidence that will be quite meaningful. Let me just leave it at that. So that's the way we're trying to influence things. That's how we're trying to approach this, exactly as has just been described by Chandila, this kind of pincer movement, the kind of polite, tactful, diplomatic, evidence-based, parliamentary type route, as well as the kind of activity that others are also deploying around legal claims, litigation, compensation, and all the rest of it. There is no reason to do one or the other. We should actually do everything exactly as Chandila has just said, and our belief is that that's the best way to go. Thanks for these points. It's a really interesting conversation. We're going to go to Barry James, who's got a real and a digital hand up. Barry, to you. Thank you.
I'll put both my actual hands up. How about that? Let me suggest that the unifying theme here, and it's a really important thing, is justice. We all know this is systematic, systematized wrongdoing, and it's given permission, and we need to take that permission away. And in order to do that, Andy, as you just said absolutely rightly, to do that, we need to be strategic. We need to be going after these compensations because that's part of justice as well, and individuals and people. It's incredibly valuable when people are brave enough to put themselves out there for that. And it's, you know, without that, it's really hard to proceed anyway. But over and above that, we also need that strategy. And I've been tracking the FCA for around 10 years and have managed to achieve, in terms of innovation, the innovation piece, a structural change. And that came about through forming an all-party parliamentary group and a strategy that, you know, like the one that you're talking about. What am I saying? What I'm saying is this is multi-layered. And it is about justice, but it's also in order to, you know, if we had all the claims paid and this carried on, that wouldn't be a very complete or good result, because there'll be just more people being chewed up. We know we need that strategy, Andy. You know, I'm going to help all I can, but we need and we need to support the strategy that you're leading in order to get systematic change. And actually, final words from me, that's what Parliament's supposed to be there for. Not what government's there for. Government's there to govern. Parliament's there, and the all-party parliamentary groups as part of it are there to challenge government and actually beyond that. So again, you know, power to your elbow, Andy and the team, but we need that strategy, and we need to recognise that it's not isolated incidents. We can see that across the board tonight. This is systemic, and we need to go to the root of it.
Thank you very much indeed. I absolutely support what you're saying. Thank you. Let's go to Carolyn. Carolyn, could you please, if possible, make yourself visible? Either way, though, please introduce yourself, then jump into your point. Thank you, Carolyn.
Can you see me now? No.
We can't see you. We can now. Thank you, Carolyn. Please share your thought. Thank you.
I've actually, as I'm sure you know, and my story is fairly well known. I found myself, like the post office people, convicted for animal welfare issues wrongly, and I've cleared my name on 3 charges. I have to go back to court to clear my name on another 3 charges. Now, when I cleared my name in Winchester Crown Court, it was very obvious that Lloyds Bank and their LPA receiver were behind my prosecution. Now, I'm actually going back to court to clear 3 environment charges, really stupid charges that were brought. But I'm also going to be claiming that Hampshire Trading Standards, who took out the prosecution in the first place, colluded with Lloyds Bank to steal my land. Now, documentation I got through disclosures and through Lloyds SAR process clearly shows that lawyers were reporting me. Now, when I went to Winchester Crown Court in my appeal, which I represented myself, I actually took evidence from 4 other Lloyds victims where they'd either been prosecuted or lawyers had attempted to get them prosecuted. I mean, this is disgusting.
It certainly is. I don't think anybody could possibly doubt that. That kind of conduct is just atrocious, Carolyn. Thank you very much for telling us about what's happening there, and keep us posted, Carolyn. We're very interested in your updates.
I'm going back to court, so if I clear my name, then that'll make a huge difference. Or totally clear my name. My name's not cleared now.
It will, Carolyn, and please keep us updated with every step is taken. Thank you very much indeed, folks. It's coming up to 9 o'clock. I suggest we put a hard close at 9:15. Okay, so we've got 15 minutes to make the most of this. By the way, TTF is running on such little resources. Please do become subscription members if you can. We've structured our subscription membership so that everybody can afford to help a little bit, even if it really is just a little bit, but every little bit counts. Let's go to Okra. I may be mispronouncing your name. I'm sorry if I am. Okra, could you please make yourself visible if possible and make your point? Thank you.
Hi, I've unmuted. It's actually Juliet. Can you hear me?
Sorry, yeah. Sure,
no, it's because on my iPhone it comes out my daughter's name. But I've got a question to ask, and the question is that I'm an HBOS Reading victim, and I did actually appear in a film called Spank the Banker, which showed what these vile crooks did in that they posed as fake bailiffs and crowbarred the door down and threw my children into the street. And since then, we've been fighting, endlessly. But what I'd like to ask today is there anybody online who's actually, a previous employee or an employee at the moment for PwC or Lloyds or RBS, NatWest? And if there is, what do they actually think about what's going on? Because they've heard some of the horror stories, and we're all accustomed to hearing it. To be honest with you, I just think it's devastated lives. I've been at one of the AGMs and seen a fellow victim just crying and crying and crying when they've come up with all the mental health, because I think lots of us have been diagnosed with this. Yeah. And me myself, I already had a life debilitating illness. I suffer with Crohn's disease and I have to be injected with immune suppressants. And in my take, that's what Lloyds prey on. They prey, it doesn't matter, they don't discriminate. It doesn't matter whether you're disabled, whether you're male, whether you're female, old, young, they do not discriminate. They are out for stripping you of your assets and they will stop at nothing. And so I'm wanting to know really, is there anybody who's still in one of these positions that's actually in on this phone call? And if so, or not on this phone call, this Zoom meeting? And if so, what do they actually think of what's going on? You know, are there any comments?
Julian, my comment is I'm pretty sure we've got nobody on the session from any of those organisations you mentioned. But your question actually points to a really big problem. It takes one hell of a person, right, to be like a Paul Carlier or the various other whistleblowers out there to stand up and say what's going on, because they are surrounded by reasons not to. You know, this is the reason why the work around whistleblowing is so important. Thank you, Julia, for your point. I know that Paul Carlier wants to say something relating to that, and then we'll go to Kim Schweitzer. Paul?
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Paul Carlier?
Yeah, the problem is there's an underlying issue here. We all know about NDAs and things like that. I mean, I've actually seen in recent months what I would say was an industrial NDA, where basically people were offered redundancy instead of leaving Lloyds because they were fed up. Offered redundancy, but to get the redundancy, they had to sign an affidavit saying that during my time at Lloyds, I saw no wrongdoing. Then they get the redundancy, and then a few months later, they get a letter in the post saying you have signed this to the effect to say that you saw no wrongdoing. Therefore, if you ever come forward and raise concerns about this, we will come after you for fraud because you signed a fraudulent instrument. I mean, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. But there it is. That's
signing something under duress. So if it's signed under duress,
and I wouldn't be discouraged by that. I mean, when Lloyds announced their investigation into FX in December 13, we were forced to sign NDAs without having access to independent legal advice. Melissa LaHood, head of commercial litigation at Lloyds, forbade us to show the NDA to any third party. And the only third party I'd raised was my lawyer, and said, you don't need independent legal advice. Now, but the problem is, once you've signed it, there is an enforceable thing that, and a lot of people will be fearful of that. But there's another issue here, and the biggest barrier to people coming forward are actually FCA rules. Years ago, the FCA changed rules whereby they made it that if you witnessed some wrongdoing, and you failed to report it, you were automatically regarded as guilty as the person that you witnessed do the wrongdoing. So therefore, if you didn't come forward straight away or report it straight away, you could never come forward, because otherwise you would be implicated and treated as guilty by the FCA as the person that did it. So you've heard of mortgage prisoners. You've actually got decent people that were understandably scared to raise concerns at the time, who now cannot come forward and say it because they will be treated by the FCA as guilty as the person that did it. So these people are trapped. And I know so many people good people that work within banks that were rightly fearful of their job. And it is, because if you put in a position where you witness wrongdoing, it's lose-lose. You either speak up now and suffer the retaliation that you will get, or you don't speak up, get found out later, and then suffer later. So you are in an absolutely shocking position. And you're not making that decision just because in your interest. You've got a family to think about. What happens if you lose your job? What about your kids' future? So people are understandably reluctant to come forward, especially when they see how others are treated. But then, having not done that, they're forever trapped and can never speak up. And that's why a lot of people I get a contact from a lot of people that want to speak up, but will speak up or raise things with me because they are in a position where they can't. And I've mentioned this to the FCA. I have said, I've mentioned it to the Treasury Select Committee when Nicky Morgan was chair, you need to offer people an amnesty. So in other words, that if they were understandably concerned about coming forward, then they will not be punished if they come forward now. I would make an exception that if you're implicated in it, you don't deserve that exception. But if you're implicated in it, then you should be free to come forward now without fear of implication.
Okay. Thank you very much for initiating that exchange, Julian. As always, Paul, thank you for your input. We're going to go to Kim Schweitzer, then we're going to go back to Sebastian, then to Trevor.
Well, I just wanted to reply to Julia's question about anybody working with PwC or RBS, which I worked for both and am not now. And David Lady, and David, you're off camera, so I don't know if we know one another through TTF, but he also had a question on whether or not I knew anything while I was working there. And you have to understand, these organizations are massive organizations. So from my experience, I've never seen any of the indiscretions that, you know, we've talked about tonight or at the RBS symposium or any of the other earlier symposiums. My prior work and, you know, what I've done for my career is in total rewards, and most of that time was spent in pre and post M&A, but also some executive compensation. And I can tell you, across the board, in all different types of organizations, there are good behaviors and bad behaviors. And no behaviors did I ever see that I needed to make a report to anyone. But again, these are massive organizations we're talking about. I'm one person of many, many thousands of people in that organization. And, you know, the reason that I work so closely with Andy and the TTF community is because I firmly believe that culture is something that needs to be changed in many of these organizations. Clearly from my total rewards and the executive compensation and the M&A work that I've done, incentives drive behaviors. And so that is something that we need to work on. But don't assume that people who are working for these organizations have knowledge of what, you know, we're hearing about here, because oftentimes we don't. We just know that it's something that we need to focus on and make sure, if at all possible, we can stop it from happening to anyone else. You know, lofty goal, but we're willing to try. And that's why I work with Andy so closely.
And Kim, your help is fantastic. Kim helps us run our LinkedIn account. She does a damn good job, and she really does do a damn good job. And we haven't got the resources to do what we're doing. We are punching above our weight. So the only way we can physically cope with it all is by people volunteering. I don't mind saying it. I work 7 days a week, and it's not doing me any good. But if anybody's got an hour or more per month, 1 hour or more per month, that you can volunteer to do something for the TTF cause, then please do step forward. And Kim's an absolute star in terms of the way that she helps us. It really is great. The idea is if lots of people give us a little bit, it can make a huge difference. Thank you, Kim. We're going to go to Sebastian, then we're going to go to Trevor. Sebastian, thank you.
Andy, delighted to help. I'm reporting into Anthony Stansfeld, and I'm lobbying with him into the House of Commons, basically as of today. This is getting bigger. I think you've done a remarkable job. I don't need to blow up your nose and say how wonderful you are, but I'm really impressed with what I've seen tonight. The point I was going to make is you're working with Kevin, who's remarkable, and Simon Reevell, an ex-MP, he was very helpful to me. Can you, you're probably doing this already, but I'd say to everybody on the call, you know, put some ideas into the team, and in terms of policy, what Julian mentioned about whistleblowing, absolutely right. There should be a clear agenda. There's somebody had to sign something under duress because it was obviously clear they wouldn't get money if they didn't. The House of Commons to deal with that, and I just wanted to come in with that is part of the policy team that you guys will be dealing with. But yeah, Andrew, be in touch, and I'll do all I can to help. And I'm going to sign off, but thank you guys. It's been humbling. It's been very interesting. Will May, I have literally not seen for 40 years. I didn't realize he'd suffered so much. He's done a remarkable job. And so thank you to all. But just leaving you with a message, we don't lose in Scotland. Well, unless we're playing England. So God bless, and well done. Cheers.
So, Sebastian, just before you go, from my point of view, there's one particular policy development that is really worth backing and supporting. Cutting a long story short, we're very connected to what's been happening in Australia in relation to the Royal Commission. One of the major policy responses to the catastrophic regulatory failure down under has been the development of a formal, full-time, heavy-duty, robust oversight committee that is truly representative of the people, watching like a hawk what the regulators are doing. there's an opinion developing within Parliament that we need something similar, and that the Treasury Select Committee is frankly not geared up to do anything like that. It's not capable of doing it. It's too small, too incapable. So we are going to be pushing very strongly for a formal, heavy-duty, robust regulatory oversight committee made up of members of both houses to drive that forward. So that's the kind of thing that we're working on from a policy point of view. Thank you, Sebastian. Lovely to have you with us. Let's now jump straight to Mr.
Well,
go on, Sebastian. Yeah, Sebastian, go
thanks, on. Andy. Cheers.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Trevor. Trevor, over to you.
Oh, no, I'm here. I was going to make a point, just so you know. I had two very distinctive uncles about 150 years ago that started the sheep industry in Darling Downs. I have 4,500 cousins in Australia, and some of them are in Parliament. So if you want some help, let me know. I'll be delighted to push that. And I think it's happening anyway, Andrew. I think it's a message I tried to give everybody before. I'm getting really responsive. I'm getting real response. I may be wrong. If I'm wrong, then I'll have to embarrass myself by telling you all in a year's time that my belief in the honour of the present members of the House of Commons was misplaced, but I don't think it is. So delighted to help with Australia. Just give me a set of instructions, Andrew, and I'll work for you. God bless. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Whether you're right or wrong, I'm sure that working together is going to make a difference. Really good stuff. There's some very constructive things coming out from tonight. It looks like Trevor's okay, so he doesn't need to make a point. Would anybody else like to share something before we start bringing the session to a close? I'm just checking everyone's okay, in which case I think we can. So let me just briefly recap. I think we've had a wonderful selection of speakers, particular thanks to Mike McGarth for being the inspiration behind this event and putting together a great crew of people who've been happy to speak truth to power so naturally and so effectively. Thank you all very much indeed. We've heard from Kevin Hollinrake, Anthony Stansfeld, Mike himself, Professor David Llewellyn added a lovely kind of academic slant to this, William May and his wonderful wife Frances. I won't forget Francis's talk for such a long time because it was very, very powerful. Keith Elliott, what a case that is. I mean, absolutely horrific treatment there. Chandila spoke very eloquently about some of the kind of legal strategy. Paul Carlier, what can you say about Paul Carlier other than he's very, very easy to listen to? You should be making movies, Paul. You really should. And Robert Kibbler as well. Such a gentle, kind, thoughtful man. And when people like him are mistreated the way he has been, it's obvious that the banks really don't care about the kind of carnage they're causing for people. We have to fight, and unless unless this problem is fixed one way or another, it will carry on. The incentives are all about people being highly rewarded for doing the kind of things we've been hearing about tonight. The incentive structures are massively, massively powerful. It will carry on unless it's stopped. That's what we've got to do. I don't know what the answer is, but I do know there's a better chance of us fixing what needs to be fixed if we're able to find ways to work together. And to my mind, that's exactly what we've been doing tonight. We've been finding ways to share thoughts and ideas. We've been collaborative, we've been collegiate, and I'm sure it's going to increase the chances of us having success if we carry on behaving like this. Thank you all very much indeed. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you. Good night all. Good night all. Well done. Thank you.